Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The last customer came in at 11:42. I noticed because I had counted one till and wanted to finish the controlled drug register before midnight. His name was Mr. Pell. He was in his 60s, wore a flat cap, and usually smelled faintly of engine oil. That night, he kept rubbing his jaw while I checked his antibiotics. While I printed the label, he turned toward the front windows. "Someone waiting for you?" I asked. He did not answer straight away. Then he said, "No, thought I saw somebody out there." I handed him the bag. At the door, he stopped and stared across the car park until the automatic door started closing against his shoulder. I watched him walk quickly to his van. As his headlights swept over the empty spaces, I saw a person standing beside the trolley shelter. They looked tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. They stood completely still with their head tipped back. I assumed they were waiting for a lift, but the way they stood looked odd. Their arms hung straight down, their face pointed at the clouds. At midnight, I locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and switched off the public lights. The dispensary lights stayed on. With the windows dark, I could see outside clearly. The figure remained. They had not moved. A car came slowly along the access road, its driver checking the closed shops. For a moment, it blocked my view. When it cleared, the person was gone. There was nowhere nearby to go except behind the shelter, but I had seen no movement. A few seconds later, the figure stood in the same place again. I told myself they had stepped behind the shelter and back out. I checked the back door and the CCTV monitor. The door was locked. The car park camera was broken, and the working one only showed the delivery entrance. When I returned to the front, the figure seemed closer, maybe one row closer. The faded markings made it hard to tell, but they seemed to be near the disabled bays. I nearly called the police, but I did not know what I would say. Someone was standing outside looking at the sky. I called Martin, the store manager, who lived 20 minutes away. He asked if they were trying the door. I said no. He told me to stay inside and call the police if they approached. He offered to drive over, but I said it was probably unnecessary. I regretted that as soon as we hung up. The pharmacy was on the edge of Osset, between the bypass and a line of warehouses. It had rained earlier and low clouds moved across the sky. I kept working, though I checked the window every minute or two. The figure vanished twice more. Both times a vehicle passed between us. First a lorry, then a taxi that looped through the car park. Each time, the figure disappeared behind it and returned when it had gone. This time they were closer, standing near the spot where Mr. Pell's van had been. I could see pale hands under the lamps. They wore a long dark coat or loose rain jacket. Their head remained tilted back. No phone, no bag, no umbrella. I knocked on the glass. Maybe I wanted to prove they were a normal person. The sound was sharp in the empty shop. The figure did not react. I knocked again, harder. Their head lowered slowly, and their face turned toward the window. I could not see any features. They should not have been able to see me behind the dark glass, but their face settled directly on where I stood. I stepped. A car came around the roundabout, its headlights sliding across the hedge. It passed in front of the pharmacy. The figure disappeared. When the view cleared, they did not return. I waited behind the counter for 10 minutes. My car was out front, and walking around the building in the dark seemed worse than staying inside. At 12:31, a sound started above the ceiling. It was a low vibration, like heavy machinery far away. I felt it through the floor, and the hanging sign over the cold medicine aisle trembled. I switched off the fan. The vibration continued. It grew stronger, then stopped all at once. After it stopped, I could not hear traffic, the clock, or even the refrigerator behind me. I looked at the clock. The second hand had stopped between marks. Then it jumped forward and continued. My phone showed 12:34. I was sure the sound had begun at 12:31. I had no memory of 3 minutes passing. I put on my coat and decided to leave without finishing the last form. Before I reached the alarm panel, the security light outside dimmed. It did not switch off. It faded to a dull orange. The other car park lamps did the same, one after another from the bypass toward the pharmacy. I could still see the clouds. Something large was moving between them. At first, it looked like a darker patch, but the shape stayed together while cloud moved across it. It passed above the supermarket roof without lights or engine sound. I could not judge its height. Its edges kept fading into the cloud. It was not round. It looked longer at the front and wider at the back, though that might have been the cloud. It moved too slowly for any aircraft I knew. The low vibration returned. The windows hummed. Plastic baskets rattled. Pressure built in my ears like during a plane landing. Then I saw the person again. They were directly below the front window, so close that I could only see the top of their head and shoulders. They were not looking at me. Their head was tilted back toward the shape. I crouched behind the counter. For no sensible reason, I thought the person and the shape belonged together. I stayed low. Bottles clicked together on the shelves. I crawled to the alarm panel and entered the code. The beeps sounded much louder than usual. I expected the person outside to react. Nothing happened. I waited beside the delivery door, afraid the figure might be around the corner. The pressure in my ears increased, then released. Normal sound returned. The refrigerator started with a clunk. A car passed on the bypass. Water dripped from the gutter. My phone showed 12:41. I called Martin again. I told him I was leaving through the back and asked him to stay on the phone. He heard my voice and did not question it. I opened the delivery door. The service lane was empty. My car was on the other side of the building, along a narrow path by the wall. I walked fast with Martin on speaker. He kept asking what I could see. At the corner, I stopped. The person stood beside my car. Their back was toward me. Their head was raised. The sky looked normal again. Clouds moved across the moon. No dark shape remained. I whispered that someone was by my car. Martin told me to go back inside and call the police. A van came along the access road before I could move. Its headlights passed over the person. For 1 second, the van blocked my view. When it cleared, the space beside my car was empty. I ran. I unlocked the car, got inside, and locked the doors. The keys slipped twice before I started the engine. The dashboard clock read 12:47. I reversed too fast and nearly hit the curb. As I drove toward the roundabout, I checked the mirror. The figure stood beneath the pharmacy sign. They were facing the shop, not the sky. A white car entered the car park behind me and crossed the mirror. When it passed, the figure was gone again. I drove home using the main roads. Martin stayed on the phone until I reached my street. I did not tell him about the shape, only that the lights had failed and somebody had frightened me. Leanne was waiting in the kitchen. I checked every window and did not sleep. At around 3, I heard a faint pulsing sound outside. Leanne could not hear it. I saw only parked cars and rain. The next morning, Martin met me before opening. The supermarket manager let us view the camera covering the access road. The footage showed Mr. Pell leaving at 11:47, the taxi at 12:16, and me running to my car at 12:47. It did not show anyone standing in the car park. At 12:33, the video broke into static for 7 minutes. When the image returned, the lamps were bright and the clouds looked ordinary. Martin asked whether I had taken anything from the dispensary. He tried to sound casual. I told him no. We opened on time. At about 10, Mr. Pell returned. He said I had given him 1 box when the prescription called for 2. He kept glancing at the front windows while I corrected it. I asked what he had seen outside the previous night. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I thought it was a man at first." He took the bag and left. That afternoon, I found a mark on the inside of the front window near the bottom edge where the person's head had been. It was an oval patch about the size of a palm, clearer than the glass around it. It was not a handprint or grease. It looked as if someone had breathed on the window from inside the locked shop and wiped the fog away with a sleeve. I cleaned it twice. By closing time, the patch had appeared again. I entered Green Park Station at 11:48 p.m. because that was the time on the clock above the ticket barriers. I had stayed late at work helping with a stock count. My office was near Piccadilly, and I lived in Vauxhall, so I usually took the Victoria line south. Green Park to Vauxhall was only 2 stops. Even late at night, the train journey itself took about 6 minutes. The station was quieter than normal, but not empty. A couple stood near the barriers, arguing softly about directions. A man in a dark suit walked ahead of me carrying a folded umbrella. Somewhere below, a train pulled away and the vibration came up through the floor. I tapped my bank card and went down the escalator. The first odd thing was the heat. It had been a cold, wet evening outside. My coat was damp around the shoulders, but halfway down the escalator, the air became warm and dry. Not normal underground heat. It felt like standing near an open oven. The man with the umbrella was about 10 steps ahead of me. He loosened his tie, but otherwise did not react. At the bottom, the signs directed passengers through a tiled passage toward the southbound platform. I had used that station hundreds of times, but the passage seemed longer than I remembered. I could not see the far end at first. The ceiling lights repeated into the distance, every third one flickering. I checked my phone, 11:50. There was no signal, which was common in that part of the station. A recorded announcement played through the speakers, but it was so distorted that I could not understand it. The voice sounded stretched, as though the recording had been slowed slightly. The man ahead of me stopped walking and looked up at the nearest speaker. Then the announcement ended, and he carried on. When I reached the platform, 9 people were waiting. I noticed the number because they were spaced out in a strange, even way, almost one person beneath each section of the curved wall. Nobody stood near anyone else. There was an older woman in a red coat, a young man in jogging clothes, 2 teenage girls, the suited man, and 4 others farther down. Most were looking at their phones. The display said southbound train, 1 min. I stood near the middle of the platform. Water ran somewhere behind the wall. I could hear it clearly because nobody was talking. Even the 2 teenage girls stood in silence, though one of them held her phone toward the other as if she had been showing her something. The display changed to dew. Wind pushed out of the tunnel. The lights in the tunnel appeared first, but something about them looked wrong. Normally, I saw 2 bright headlights and the lit windows behind them. This train came forward with only 1 headlight visible. The other side of the front was dark. As it approached, the second light came on. It did not flicker. It simply appeared. The train stopped with the doors lined up normally. The carriages looked older than the ones I usually saw on that line. The paint around the doors was scratched, and several windows were cloudy from the inside. The doors opened. There were already passengers on board, maybe 15 in my carriage. Plenty of empty seats remained, but nobody got off. I sat near the middle, facing backward. The older woman in the red coat sat opposite me. The suited man remained standing by the doors. The doors closed at 11:53. I knew the time because I sent my wife Natalie a message saying I would be home in 15 minutes. The message remained unsent. The train moved off. For the first 30 seconds, everything seemed normal. The carriage rocked gently and the wheels made the usual high scraping noise on the curve. The lights inside buzzed. An advertisement above the seats had peeled away at one corner. Then the sound of the wheels stopped. The train was still moving. I could feel it. The carriage swayed, and the dark wall outside passed the windows, but there was no rail noise at all. I looked around. Nobody reacted. The older woman stared at the floor between her shoes. The suited man held the pole with one hand and watched his own reflection in the glass. I checked my phone again. 11:54. Still no signal. We should have reached Victoria within 2 minutes. Instead, the tunnel continued. I tried to judge our speed from the cables and signs outside, but there were fewer lights than normal. Long sections of the tunnel were completely dark. Every so often, a small blue lamp passed the window. After several minutes, the train slowed. I expected the platform at Victoria to appear, but we passed a narrow service area instead. There was a concrete walkway beside the track and a gray metal door in the wall. A man stood in front of the door. He wore what looked like an orange maintenance vest, but there were no reflective strips on it. His arms hung by his sides. He watched the train pass without moving his head. I turned to keep looking at him. The older woman opposite me lifted her eyes. "Did you see him?" I asked. She looked directly at me, then lowered her gaze again. The train picked up speed. I felt embarrassed, as though I had broken some rule by speaking. A minute later, the carriage lights dimmed. The emergency strips stayed on, giving everyone's face a flat yellow color. That was when several passengers began looking through the windows. Not all at once. The suited man turned first, then one of the teenage girls, then a bald man seated near the far doors. They did not glance outside, they stared. Their faces were close to the glass, and their eyes followed something beside the train. I looked too. At first I saw only my reflection and the dark tunnel wall. Then the wall disappeared. There was open darkness beyond the window. I do not mean an unlit section of tunnel. I could not see cables, concrete, pipes, or the reflection of passing lights. It looked as though the track ran beside a large, empty space. The train's interior reflected faintly in the glass. Behind the reflection was nothing. The people staring through the windows seemed calm. The teenage girl tilted her head slightly, following something lower down. I moved to the seat beside the opposite window and looked out from a sharper angle. Far away in the dark, several pale lights moved in a line. They were small and weak, like torches seen across a field. They did not blink. They moved at the same speed as the train. I counted 4. Then a 5th appeared above them. It was much larger and oval-shaped. It gave off no beam, but the darkness around it seemed lighter, enough to show a vague, curved surface. The older woman spoke without looking up. "Don't lean against the window." Her voice was quiet, but clear. I sat back. "What is that?" I asked. She did not answer. The carriage lights returned to full brightness. The tunnel wall was outside again, close enough that I could see the joints in the concrete. The other passengers turned away from the windows. My phone showed 11:57. Only 3 minutes had passed. I assumed we had been held between stations, though the train had never stopped. I expected an announcement from the driver. None came. The route map above the doors showed the station lights. Green Park was unlit behind us. Victoria should have been flashing as the next stop. Instead, every light on the map was off. I stood and walked to the intercom near the doors. There was a red emergency button under a clear cover. Before I touched it, the suited man said, "That won't help." He had a tired face and a small cut on his chin. His voice sounded ordinary. "Do you know why we haven't stopped?" I asked. He looked toward the far end of the carriage. "We will." "At Victoria?" He gave a small shrug. The train began to slow again. This time there was a platform. The sign on the wall was blank. It had the normal red and blue underground design, but no station name appeared in the center. The platform itself was narrow and badly lit. No one waited there. The train stopped. The doors did not open. I looked through the window at a wooden bench. A black rubbish bag sat beneath it. There was an old clock on the wall, the kind with hands instead of a digital display. It showed 12:19. I checked my phone, 11:59. The second hand on the platform clock moved backward 1 mark, paused, then moved forward again. A speaker crackled somewhere outside the train. A woman's voice said, "Please remain where you are." The announcement repeated. The second time, the voice sounded closer, as though it came from inside the carriage. One of the teenage girls started crying. She made no sound. Tears ran down her face while she kept staring straight ahead. Her friend held her hand, but did not look at her. I went to the door and pressed the open button, though I knew passengers could not normally control it. Nothing happened. Across the platform, beyond an opening in the tiled wall, something moved past. I saw only a section of it. It was pale and tall, but it did not move like a person walking. It seemed to slide slowly from left to right. The top passed above the height of the doorway. The suited man turned his back to the window. The older woman closed her eyes. The thing stopped just beyond the opening. A thin shadow extended across the platform floor toward the train, though the lights were behind it. The carriage became warm again. My ears started to feel blocked. I swallowed, but the pressure did not clear. The train doors made the warning tone. For 1 second, I thought they were going to open. Instead, every door on the carriage shifted inward slightly, as though someone had pulled them from outside. The rubber seals stretched. A narrow black line appeared between the panels. The teenage girl squeezed her friend's hand. The older woman said, "Not this one." The doors settled back into place. I asked her what she meant, but the train started moving before she replied. The blank platform slipped away. Through the opening in the wall, I saw the pale shape standing sideways. It appeared too narrow for its height. There were no details on it, no face or clothing, just a lighter section against the dark. As the last part of the platform passed, its upper half turned toward the train. The tunnel wall returned. My phone changed from 11:59 to 12. The train gathered speed. The rail noise came back, but it was slower than our movement. Each clack sounded far apart, like we were passing over joints every 100 meters. Then something tapped the window behind me. It was a light sound. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. Nobody looked around except me. I turned slowly. There was nothing outside but the wall. The tapping came again from the next window down. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. It moved along the carriage against our direction of travel, one window at a time. Passengers stared at their hands or the floor. The suited man shut his eyes as it approached him. The taps reached the window beside the teenage girls. The one who had been crying whispered, "Please." Her friend pulled her closer. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then there was one heavy knock directly above them. Both girls flinched. The lights went out. In the darkness, the train seemed to stop moving. I could not feel any vibration. I heard people breathing and the faint rustle of clothing. A soft light appeared outside. The oval shape moved beside the carriage. It was not as far away as before. It filled most of the window opposite me, though I still could not tell how large it was or how close. Its surface looked dull, like fogged glass. Several faint points of light shifted beneath it. Every passenger who had stared out earlier now looked directly at it. Their faces were blank. I tried not to look, but my eyes kept returning to the window. The points beneath the surface formed a loose curve. They stayed that way for a few seconds, then separated again. The pressure in my ears became painful. I lowered my head and covered them with my hands. There was a sound like air being pulled through a narrow gap. Underneath it, I heard voices. They were too faint to understand, but one sounded like Natalie calling from another room. I knew she was at home. I kept my eyes on the floor. A dark, wet patch spread across the rubber flooring between my shoes. I moved my feet, thinking something had leaked from my bag, but I was not carrying one. The patch expanded until it formed a rough oval. It reflected the pale light from outside. Within the reflection, I saw the carriage from above. Everyone sat in their correct places except me. My seat looked empty. I stood quickly and moved away from it. The reflected view changed a moment later. A blurred shape appeared where I had been sitting. The lights came back. The wet patch was gone. The tunnel wall passed outside at normal speed. The oval light had vanished. My phone read 12:24. I had no idea where the missing 24 minutes had gone. It felt as though the lights had been out for less than 1 minute. The route map above the doors came back on. Victoria was dark behind us. Pimlico flashed as the next stop. Nobody spoke. The teenage girl wiped her face. The older woman adjusted the belt on her coat. The suited man checked his watch. They acted as though nothing unusual had happened. I asked, louder this time, "How long have we been on this train?" The bald man at the far end looked at me. "Couple of minutes," he said. "We left Green Park before midnight." He frowned and looked at the route map. "No, we didn't." I showed him my phone. It read 12:25. He held up his own screen. 11:56. The suited man's watch showed something different again. I saw the minute hand near the 4, but he covered the face with his sleeve when he noticed me looking. The train entered Pimlico station. The platform clock read 12:26. People stood before the doors had opened. Their movements were calm and automatic. The older woman gave me a brief look as she got up. I asked her, "Has this happened before?" She stepped closer and said, "Go out when they do." "Who?" She looked toward the windows. The doors opened. I got off with 6 other passengers. The air on the platform was cool. Normal advertisements covered the walls. A member of staff stood near the exit checking something on a clipboard. I turned back toward the train. Several passengers had remained inside, including the suited man and the 2 girls. They were all looking through the windows on the opposite side into the dark tunnel wall. The suited man raised one hand and placed his palm against the glass. Something pale moved behind his reflection. The doors closed. The train left. I went straight to the staff member and asked why the journey from Green Park had taken so long. He looked at his watch. "It didn't," he said. I told him I had boarded at 11:53. He checked a small screen on the wall. That train left Green Park at 12:20, he said. Arrived here on time. I showed him the message I had tried to send Natalie. It was stamped 11:53 and still marked undelivered. He said my phone clock must have been wrong. I asked whether there were any closed platforms or service stops between Green Park and Pimlico. He stared at me for a second, then said no. The clock above the escalator changed to 12:27. I left the station and called Natalie from the pavement. The message from the train sent while the phone was ringing. She answered immediately and asked where I had been. She said she had received a call from my number at 12:06. When she answered, nobody spoke, but she heard a train in the background and a woman repeating, "Please remain where you are." I took a taxi home. At 1:03, I unlocked our front door. Natalie was waiting in the hall. She had kept the call in her recent history, but when we opened the details, the number was not mine. It contained 15 digits and began with 4 zeros. The next morning, I contacted Transport for London and requested my journey history. The record showed I had entered Green Park at 11:48 p.m. and exited Pimlico at 12:27 a.m. I submitted a complaint and mentioned the delay. Their reply said the southbound train had departed Green Park at 11:52 and arrived at Pimlico at 11:58. No disruption had been reported. When I checked the journey history again, the exit time had changed. It now said 11:58. The original screenshot remained on my phone. 2 weeks later, I passed through Pimlico after work. It was early evening and crowded. While I waited for the escalator, I noticed the older woman in the red coat standing on the opposite platform. She was facing the tunnel instead of the tracks. As a train passed between us, I lost sight of her. When it cleared, the platform was empty, except for a black rubbish bag beneath a wooden bench. I took the first photo at 10:18 on a Thursday night from the concrete pad behind my garage. The sky had cleared after 2 days of rain, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. I had my small tracking mount set up with a used Canon camera and a 135mm lens. Nothing expensive. I had bought most of it secondhand over the years. I was photographing a section of Cygnus because I wanted to practice stacking images. I had done the same area several times before. It was easy to find from my garden, even with the light from the housing estate behind us. My wife, Claire, was inside watching television. Our son was away at university. I remember the normal details because nothing seemed unusual at the time. A dog barked 2 streets over. Somebody rolled a wheelie bin down a path. A plane crossed low toward Manchester, blinking red and white through the thin cloud near the horizon. I took 20 exposures at 2 minutes each. A few had light trails from aircraft, so I deleted those later. The rest looked ordinary on the camera screen. I packed up around 11, carried everything into the utility room, and left the tripod outside because the forecast was clear again the following night. I processed the images on Friday afternoon. There was nothing special in them. I could see Deneb near the edge, the usual dense star field, and a faint patch of nebula that only became visible after stacking. I saved the final image and wrote down my settings in a notebook. On Friday night, I went out at almost the same time. The weather was colder and completely still. There had been some mist earlier, but it had cleared. The sky looked sharper than the night before. I used the marks I had made on the patio to place the tripod in the same position. The tracker was already set to the correct angle. I lined up the frame using Deneb and 2 smaller stars near the lower right corner. Before I started, I noticed a pale light above the roofs to the east. It was not moving. It looked brighter than Jupiter, but smaller than the moon. I checked an astronomy app on my phone, though I knew Jupiter was nowhere near that part of the sky. The light faded while I was looking at the screen. It did not blink out. It became weaker over maybe 5 seconds until I could not see it. I assumed it had been an aircraft turning away from me. That happened often enough. A plane flying directly toward you could look motionless, then vanish when it changed direction. I started the sequence. About 10 minutes later, I heard a soft clicking from behind the fence. It sounded like someone tapping 2 stones together. 3 clicks, then a pause, then two more. There was a narrow service path behind the garden, but nobody used it at that hour except people walking dogs. I looked over the fence with a torch. The path was empty. When I returned to the camera, the tracker had stopped. The power light was still on, but the motor was not moving. I switched it off and on. It started again. The battery was almost full. I checked the last exposure. The stars were slightly trailed, which meant the tracker had stopped during the shot. I deleted it and restarted the sequence. The clicking began again. This time it came from farther down the path, near the neighbor's shed. It was slower, one click every few seconds. I called out, "Hello?" No one answered. Claire opened the back door and asked who I was talking to. I said I had heard someone behind the fence. She listened for a moment, then went back inside. The sound stopped as soon as she came out. I finished the exposures without another problem. While I was packing up, I noticed the motion light above the garage was on. It had not come on while I was moving around directly beneath it, which was normal because the sensor had been unreliable for months. What was odd was that it stayed on after I went inside. I could see the white light through the frosted utility room window. It stayed on for nearly 20 minutes. On Saturday morning, I transferred the photos to my computer. At first, they looked worse than the previous night's set. The stars near the center seemed soft, as though the focus had shifted. I checked the outer edges, but those looked sharp. I thought there might have been condensation on the lens, though I had checked for that before packing up. When I aligned the images, the software gave an error. It could not match enough stars between the first and last frames. That was unusual. The camera had not moved. The field was full of stars. Even poor images normally aligned without trouble. I tried a different program. It aligned most of them, but rejected 6 exposures from the middle of the sequence. I opened one of the rejected files and compared it with the image from Thursday. That was when I noticed the empty patch. It was near the center, slightly left of the main star cluster. At first, it looked like a dust spot, the kind caused by dirt on the camera sensor. But dust spots had soft edges and appeared in the same place on every image. This was different. It was an oval area where there should have been stars. The oval was not completely black. The background had the same gray noise as the rest of the image, but 7 or 8 stars I knew should have been there were missing. I checked the other rejected exposures. The empty oval appeared in all 6. In the first rejected image, it was small. In the next, it was slightly larger. By the 4th, it was about the apparent size of my thumbnail when viewed on the monitor. Then it became smaller again. I thought a bird might have crossed the frame, though a bird would only show in one image and would not create a clean, empty area in a 2-minute exposure. Thin cloud could dim stars, but the surrounding stars looked normal. Then I noticed something else. The stars around the oval were in the wrong places, not by much. At first I thought I had made a mistake comparing images. I opened both nights in separate windows and switched between them. 3 stars on the upper edge had moved slightly upward. 2 on the left had shifted outward. A small pair below the oval appeared farther apart than they had on Thursday. The changes were tiny, maybe a few pixels, but they formed a pattern. Everything seemed displaced away from the empty region. I checked for lens distortion. I compared stars at the edges of the frame. Those matched almost exactly. Only the stars near the oval had moved. I enlarged the images until they became blocks of pixels. I measured the distances between several stars. I wrote the numbers down. The displacement was real in the files. I called my friend Nathan, who was part of a local astronomy club. He knew much more about image processing than I did. I sent him the original files, not screenshots. He called me about half an hour later. His first question was whether I had edited them. I said no. He asked whether I had used some kind of experimental filter or old lens adapter. I said it was the same camera and lens as the previous night. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "There's something wrong with the alignment." I asked what he meant. He said the stars were being bent around a central point, but only in those 6 frames. He said it looked similar to a software effect, except the raw files showed the same thing. I asked whether it could be atmospheric distortion. He said not in that shape and not over such a small part of the sky. Then he laughed and said it was probably a camera problem. The laugh sounded forced. He asked me to photograph the same section again that night. I had already planned to. The rest of Saturday felt strange because I kept checking the files. Each time I looked, I expected to notice an obvious mistake. I expected to find that I had compared different stars or rotated one image without realizing it. I did not. At around 4 in the afternoon, I went outside to check the equipment. There was a mark on the concrete where the tripod had stood. It looked like a dark oval stain about 30 centimeters long. The concrete around it was dry. The oval was damp. I touched it. It was cold and smelled faintly metallic, like wet coins. There were no drips leading to it and nothing hanging above that spot. I washed it with a hose. The water spread across the concrete and the mark disappeared. An hour later, the rest of the patio had dried. The oval remained damp. I moved the tripod 2 meters away. That evening, cloud covered most of the sky until around 10. Then a gap opened in the west and slowly spread overhead. Claire asked if I really wanted to go out again. I had shown her the pictures, but she did not see much. She said the stars looked blurry and asked why I could not wait until another night. I said I wanted to check whether the camera was faulty. The air was colder than the previous 2 nights. Frost had formed on the grass. There was no wind, but the bare branches behind the fence moved slightly every few minutes. I set up in the new position and found the same area of sky. Everything looked normal through the camera screen. I took a short test exposure. The stars were where they should have been. I took another. Still normal. At 10:26, the clicking started behind the fence. 3 clicks. A pause. 2 clicks. Exactly the same pattern as Friday. I did not call out. I stood beside the camera and listened. The sound moved along the service path without becoming louder or softer. It was as if the source had changed position instantly between each set of clicks, near the neighbor's shed, then behind my fence, then farther down near the road. The motion light above the garage came on. At the same moment, my phone lost its signal. The astronomy app froze. The clock in the corner still showed 10:27, but the seconds did not change. I checked my watch. It had stopped too. It was an old analog watch. The second hand rested just past the 6. I could hear a low humming sound. It seemed to come from above, but when I tilted my head, it felt as though it came through the ground. The camera screen went white. Not bright white. A flat, gray white, like an overexposed image. I pressed buttons, but nothing changed. Then the screen showed the live view again. The stars near the center were gone. I could see the oval directly on the camera screen. It looked darker than the surrounding sky, though I could not see anything unusual with my eyes. I looked up. The section of sky appeared normal at first. Then I noticed that several stars near the center seemed to tremble. They did not flash. Their position seemed unstable, moving slightly sideways and returning. I thought my eyes were watering, so I blinked and wiped them. The movement continued. A faint boundary became visible between the stars. It was not an object exactly. It looked like a difference in the sky, an oval area that was slightly darker and cleaner than everything around it. No stars showed inside it. The humming deepened. The branches behind the fence stopped moving. Somewhere on the estate, a car alarm began making a weak clicking sound instead of a siren. I stepped backward toward the house. The oval did not move across the sky. It seemed to grow while staying in the same place. Stars near its edge appeared to slide outward. I watched one small star on the lower side. It shifted slowly away from the dark region, then became stretched into a short line. It stayed like that for several seconds. I heard the back door open. Claire called my name. The oval seemed to shrink at once. The stretched star returned to a point. The other stars settled into familiar positions. The humming faded until I could only hear the refrigerator running inside the kitchen. My phone signal returned. The clock jumped from 10:27 to 10:39. Claire asked why I had not answered her. She said she had called from the doorway 3 times. I had only heard her once. I checked the camera. It had taken 4 exposures without me starting the sequence. The first showed the normal star field. The second showed the empty oval. The third was completely black. The fourth looked normal again. Nathan came over the next morning. We examined the files together. He checked the camera, lens, memory card, and tracking mount. He found nothing wrong. The black image had recorded no light at all, not even sensor noise. Nathan said that should not happen unless the file had been created without an exposure, but the metadata showed 2 minutes. The image with the oval was sharper than any photograph I had taken before. The stars around the empty area were displaced farther than in the Friday images. Several were stretched into tiny arcs. Nathan copied the files onto his laptop. He said he wanted to show someone at the club. When he tried to open the copied image, it displayed as corrupted. The file on my computer still opened. He copied it again. The second copy opened but showed a normal star field with no oval. We compared the file sizes. They were identical. He left shortly after that. By Sunday evening, the damp mark on the concrete had dried. The motion light worked normally. My watch started again after I reset the time. I photographed the same section of sky for a third night. The conditions were almost identical. Clear air, light frost, no moon. Every star was back where it belonged. There was no empty patch, no distortion, and no clicking behind the fence. I took 30 exposures and stayed outside until after midnight. Just before I packed up, I checked the last image on the camera. Everything looked normal except for one faint curved line near the lower edge of the frame. I thought it was an aircraft trail. When I enlarged it on the computer, I saw that the line was made of tiny points of light, evenly spaced, bending toward the exact place where the oval had been. I heard my own voice through the baby monitor at 9:16 on a Tuesday night. I knew the exact time because I had just checked the oven clock before carrying a basket of clean laundry upstairs. My husband, Daniel, was working overnight at the distribution center, and our daughter, Sophie, had been asleep for about 40 minutes. The monitor receiver sat on the landing windowsill. It was an old audio-only model we had kept after Sophie moved into her larger bedroom. The transmitter was still plugged in inside the spare room because we sometimes used it when she slept there during hot weather. That night, the spare room was empty. As I reached the top stair, the monitor crackled. Then my voice said very clearly, "I'm putting the basket down." I stopped with the basket against my hip. The voice had come through the speaker in the calm, flat tone people used when reading instructions. It sounded like me, but slightly quieter, as though I had recorded myself from another room. A few seconds later, the basket slipped against my jumper. I put it down on the landing. I stood there looking at the receiver. The green power light was on. The sound level lights beside it were not moving. I picked it up and pressed the volume button. Static came through, then nothing. My first thought was that the monitor had picked up a neighbor. We lived in a newer estate outside Swindon with houses close together and plenty of wireless devices. Baby monitors could cross signals. I had once heard part of someone else's conversation through it when Sophie was an infant, but this had been my voice. I carried the basket into our bedroom and listened for another minute. Nothing happened. The spare room door was open. From the landing, I could see the edge of the single bed, a chest of drawers, and 2 cardboard boxes we had not unpacked since moving in. The transmitter sat on a shelf near the window. I went inside and checked it. The power light was on. The microphone opening looked dusty. There was no recording function, no app, and no internet connection. It was just a basic radio monitor we had bought at a supermarket. I unplugged it. The receiver in my hand gave a burst of static. Then my voice said, "I've unplugged it now." I nearly dropped the receiver. The transmitter cable hung loose in my other hand. I looked behind the curtains and under the bed, even though I knew nobody could have been there. The window was shut and locked. A suitcase, an ironing board, and a bag of old clothes filled the space beneath the bed. The house was quiet apart from the washing machine downstairs. I took the receiver into Sophie's room. She was asleep on her side with one arm above her head. Her nightlight gave off a dim orange glow. I stood beside her bed until I was sure she was breathing normally. The monitor hissed softly. My voice said, "I'm checking, Sophie." The words came about 3 seconds before I reached down and placed my hand against her back. I pulled my hand away. For a while I did not move at all. The receiver remained silent. I told myself I had already decided to touch her before the voice said it. Maybe I had somehow spoken without noticing. Maybe the monitor had delayed the sound. Neither explanation made sense, but they were better than the alternative, which I could not put into words. I carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen counter. The washing machine entered its spin cycle. Cups in the cupboard rattled slightly. Rain tapped against the back window. It had been raining since late afternoon, and the garden was black beyond the glass. I called Daniel. He answered after several rings, with machinery beeping behind him. I told him the monitor was picking up strange interference. I did not tell him it had predicted anything. I said it sounded like my voice and asked whether he had ever recorded something on it as a joke. He said the monitor could not record. I know. Turn it off then. I unplugged the transmitter. Take the batteries out of the receiver. I opened the battery cover while he was talking. There were 3 rechargeable batteries inside. I removed them and put the receiver on the counter. The green light stayed on. I stared at it until Daniel asked whether I was still there. The light hasn't gone off. It'll have some charge left. It shouldn't. He told me to put it in a drawer and check on Sophie. He said he could come home if I was worried, but he had only started his shift an hour earlier. I said I was fine. I ended the call and put the monitor in the kitchen junk drawer beneath a pile of takeaway menus. As I pushed the drawer closed, my voice spoke from inside it. I'm gonna lock the back door. I stood with my hand on the drawer. The back door was already closed, but I could not remember whether I had turned the key after taking the rubbish out. I decided not to check it. I went into the living room and sat on the sofa. The television was on mute. I kept looking toward the kitchen doorway. About 30 seconds passed. Then something pressed the back door handle down. I heard the metal latch click. I got up without thinking and hurried into the kitchen. The handle was back in its normal position. I turned the key and pulled on the door to make sure it was locked. From inside the drawer, the monitor said, I've locked the back door. I opened the drawer and took it out. The green light was still on, but the batteries were lying on the counter where I had left them. I held the receiver close to my ear. There was a low background sound beneath the static. At first, I thought it was wind. Then I realized it had a steady rhythm, almost like breathing through the nose. I pressed the power button. Nothing changed. I held it down. My own voice said, "That won't switch it off." The sentence came before I pressed the button again. I placed the receiver face down and stepped away. At that point, I should have gone next door or called Daniel back. Instead, I stood in the kitchen trying to work out how someone could be doing it. I wondered whether a neighbor had a scanner and was playing a recording. That did not explain why the words matched what I was about to do, but I still wanted it to be some kind of prank. I picked up my phone to call our neighbor, Imogen. Before I selected her name, the monitor said, "I won't call Imogen." My thumb stopped over the screen. I called her anyway. The call connected, but I heard no ringing. There was only the same low breathing sound I had heard from the monitor. Then my own voice came through the phone. "I'll hang up." I did. The monitor stayed silent for nearly a minute. Imogen called me back. She asked whether I had just phoned. I said yes and asked if she had heard anything odd. She said the line had been empty, apart from a faint tapping sound. While we spoke, I moved to the front window and looked across at her house. Her upstairs bedroom light was on. I could see her shape behind the curtain. I asked whether she could look at our spare room window. There was a pause. "Why?" "Just tell me if you see anything." Her curtain moved. A moment later, she said the room was dark. Then she said, "Actually, there's a little light in there." I turned toward the ceiling. "What kind of light?" "Like a phone screen, maybe." "Near the window." I told her the room was empty and the transmitter had been unplugged. The monitor said, "I'm going upstairs." I had not intended it to go upstairs until it spoke. Imogen heard it through the phone. "What was that?" she asked. I told her it was the monitor. She offered to come over, but her 2 children were asleep and her husband was away. I said I would check the room and call her back. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the ceiling light flickered. Not the bulb. The whole level of light changed, fading and returning slowly. The refrigerator motor stopped. The washing machine went quiet in the middle of its cycle. The house felt pressurized like the air before a storm. I climbed the stairs with the monitor in one hand and my phone in the other. The spare room door was still open. A weak gray light showed across the carpet. It did not come from the lamp or the ceiling fitting. It seemed to come through the closed curtains. The receiver whispered with my voice, "I'm standing outside the room." That time, it described what I was doing at the same moment, not before. I stayed on the landing. The sound level lights rose one by one, though the room itself was silent. Then my voice said, "I can see the curtain moving." The curtain was still. 3 seconds later, the left side of it lifted away from the wall. There was no open window and no heating vent beneath it. The fabric moved outwards slowly, held there for a moment, then dropped. The transmitter remained on the shelf where I had left it, unplugged. Its power light was on. I did not enter the room. I leaned across the doorway and aimed my phone camera at the window. On the screen, the gray light looked brighter than it did to my eyes. It formed a narrow vertical patch behind the curtain, about the height of a person. My camera lost focus. The patch widened. The receiver said, "I'm going to close the door." I grabbed the handle but kept the door open. For the first time, the prediction did not happen. The green light on the receiver began flashing rapidly. My voice returned, but it sounded farther away. "I'm going to close the door." I stepped back. The spare room door moved an inch toward me. I caught it with my foot. A faint sound came from inside the room. It was like someone rubbing a wet finger around the rim of a glass, low enough that I felt it more than heard it. Sophie called from her bedroom. "Mum?" I left the spare room door and went to her immediately. She was sitting up in bed, looking past me toward the landing. She asked who was talking. I told her it was the monitor. She said, "No, the lady in that room." I picked her up with one arm. She was 6 and getting too heavy to carry comfortably, but I did not want her walking past the spare room. As I turned toward the stairs, the monitor spoke again. "I'm carrying Sophie downstairs." This time there was almost no delay. I moved faster. The voice continued while I descended. "I'm halfway down." Then I'm near the front door. It was no longer ahead of me. It was keeping pace. I reached the hallway and put Sophie down long enough to pull on her coat over her pajamas. The monitor said, "I'm taking Sophie next door." I picked up my keys. The front door would not open. The lock turned, but the door felt stuck against the frame. I pulled with both hands while Sophie stood behind me. The low tone from upstairs grew louder. The monitor said, "I can't open the door." I stopped pulling. The house lights dimmed again. Through the glass panel beside the door, I saw the street lamps flicker one after another down the road. Sophie asked why the sky was white. I looked through the front window. A pale glow had formed above the houses opposite us. It was behind the clouds, spread across a wide oval area. The clouds were low and moving quickly in the rain, but the bright section stayed in the same place. There was no thunder. The light increased slowly until the wet road and parked cars looked almost like daytime. Imogen came out of her front door in a dressing gown. She stood beneath her porch roof and stared upward. The monitor went quiet. The front door opened easily. I carried Sophie across the road. Rain hit my face, but the air felt strangely warm. Several car alarms flashed without making any sound. Imogen waved us inside. Before I reached her gate, I looked back at our house. The spare room curtain was open. A dim shape stood behind the glass. It looked narrow at the shoulders and taller than the window should have allowed. I could not see features. It was darker than the room around it, except for a pale oval area near where a face would have been. The monitor in my hand crackled. My voice said, "I'm looking at the window." The bright patch above the street flashed. There was no buildup and no sound. Everything turned white for less than a second. The houses, road, rain, and trees disappeared in it. When my vision cleared, the street lamps were steady. The cloud above us was dark again. The spare room window was empty. The monitor's green light had gone out. Imogen pulled us inside. Her children were awake and sitting on the stairs. Daniel drove home after I called him, and we stayed at Imogen's until he arrived. The power in our house had not failed. The oven clock showed the correct time, and the washing machine resumed its cycle when Daniel opened the kitchen door. We checked every room together. The spare room was cold. The curtains were closed, the window was locked, and the transmitter was still unplugged. There were no marks on the floor or signs that anyone had entered. Daniel took both parts of the monitor outside and put them in the boot of his car. The receiver had no batteries. The transmitter had no backup power. The next morning, we drove Sophie to school and took the monitor to the recycling center. Daniel dropped it into the electronics container himself. I did not hear the voice again. 3 days later, I watched the video I had taken from the spare room doorway. Most of it was out of focus. The curtains showed as a gray blur, and the audio contained only static. Near the end, just before I went to Sophie, the image became clear for 2 frames. The curtain was lifted away from the wall. Behind it, the window reflected the landing where I stood holding the phone. In the reflection, I was not alone. A second shape stood close behind me, with its head bent toward the baby monitor. The next frame showed the empty landing. The first horse refused the stable door before I even got out of my truck. It was a gray mare named Tilly, and she had planted all 4 feet in the yard while her owner, Simon Greaves, tried to lead her inside. She was not pulling away or rearing. She just stood there with her neck stiff and her eyes fixed on the upper left corner of the doorway. Simon gave the rope another tug. "Come on, you daft thing." Tilly backed up so fast that Simon nearly fell. I had been called out because 3 of his horses had started acting the same way that afternoon. Simon and his wife, Judith, kept 6 horses on a small property outside Shrewsbury, not far from the Welsh border. I had treated them for years. They were well cared for, and Simon was not the type to call a vet over nothing. It was just after 4 on a damp November afternoon. Low cloud sat over the fields, and there was a light mist coming down. The yard lamps were already on. "What happened first?" I asked. Simon tied Tilly to the rail outside. "Judith came down to feed them around 2, he said. Marlowe wouldn't go into his box. Then the others started." "Anything fall from the roof?" "Not that I can see." The stable was an old brick building with 6 stalls, 3 on each side, and a central walkway. The horses were refusing to enter the back 3 stalls on the right. They had no problem with the stalls opposite. I walked in alone. There was nothing obviously wrong. No smell of gas, no buzzing wires, no loose sheeting overhead. The roof was timber and corrugated metal with a row of dusty skylights. A few cobwebs hung between the beams. I checked the floor for oil, chemicals, blood, droppings from wild animals, anything that might upset them. Nothing. Judith came in carrying a torch. "They keep looking up there," she said. She pointed to a beam above the last stall. I shone the torch over it. Dust, old nails, 1 swallow's nest from the summer. No rats, no birds. Marlowe, a large chestnut gelding, stood outside the building with his head through the door. His ears were forward and his nostrils moved as he tested the air. Then his eyes shifted. He looked slowly from the beam above the last stall toward the center of the roof. Tilly followed the same movement from outside. So did a small black pony in the yard. All 3 tracked something across the ceiling. There was nothing there. Their heads moved together, left to right, then stopped near a skylight. I looked at Simon. He had noticed it too. "Could be a bat," he said. "Maybe." I climbed a ladder and checked the beam. I ran my hand along the timber. It was dry and solid. There were no bats hanging above it. No insects either, which was slightly odd. Old stables usually had flies or spiders somewhere, even in cold weather. As I came down, a tapping sound started near the roof. It was faint. 3 quick taps, then a pause. Simon looked up. "Rain?" The mist outside had not become heavy enough to make that sound. The tapping moved along the roof from the rear wall toward the door. It did not sound like an animal running. It sounded more like someone lightly striking the metal from above with a fingertip. Tilly pulled hard against the rail. Marlowe backed away. The tapping stopped above the doorway. For a few seconds, every horse in the yard stood still. Then a flock of crows lifted from the field beyond the barn. I heard their wings before I saw them through the open door. They rose together and flew low toward the road. I checked the horses one at a time. Their temperatures were normal. Heart rates were elevated, but not dangerously high. Their eyes were clear, and there were no signs of poisoning or infection. They had eaten from the same hay supply as the others, and the 3 horses in the opposite stalls were calm. One of those calm horses, a bay mare called Fern, kept eating while I examined her. Then she stopped chewing. Her ears turned toward the roof. She raised her head and stared at the same beam. The others began watching too. Whatever they appeared to follow moved slowly over the center aisle. Fern stepped backward until her hindquarters touched the wall. That was when I felt something myself. It was not a draft. The doors were open, but the air in the stable had been still. This felt like a patch of pressure moving across my face, the way air changed when someone walked close behind you. It passed from my right side to my left. The loose hair on my forearm lifted. I turned around. Nothing stood behind me. Judith said, "Did you feel that?" I told her I had. Simon switched off the overhead lights, thinking there might be a fault in the wiring. We stood in the dim light from the doorway while he shut down the stable circuit at the fuse box. The horses continued staring upward. We used a voltage tester on the metal gates, water pipes, and support posts. Nothing showed. Simon called an electrician he knew and asked him to come in the morning. I suggested they move the horses to the field shelter for the night. The weather was wet but not freezing, and the shelter was large enough for all 6. The horses walked out willingly. Marlowe was the last one. As Simon led him past the stable door, he suddenly turned his head toward the dark interior. His eyes followed something from the ceiling down into the last stall. Then he snorted and dragged Simon into the yard. I closed the stable door. Something tapped once on the other side. We all heard it. Simon opened the door immediately. The central aisle was empty. He walked through each stall and kicked the bedding around with his boot. I checked under feed bins and behind the partitions. There was nowhere for a person to hide. I finished my notes in the kitchen while Judith made tea. Their farmhouse stood about 50 meters from the stable, with the barn between the house and the fields. Through the kitchen window, I could see the horses gathered near the shelter instead of grazing. They all faced the stable. None of them moved. Simon noticed me looking. "They've been doing that on and off since lunchtime," he said. "Any work done on the barn recently?" "No." "Anyone been on the property?" "Not that I know of." Judith set a mug down in front of me. "Our grandson said he saw a light there last week." Simon sighed. "He saw a tractor light across the field. He said it was above the barn." "He's 9. I asked what kind of light. Judith said it had been a dull white patch, not very bright, hovering above the roof. Their grandson had seen it from an upstairs bedroom around midnight. By the time Simon looked, it was gone. Simon clearly did not want to discuss it. I told them to call me if the horses became ill or injured. I also asked them not to force any horse back into the stable until the electrician had checked it. Before I left, I went to the yard one more time. The mist had thickened. My headlights reflected off it, making the barn and stable look farther away than they were. The horses still faced the stable. As I walked toward my truck, all 6 raised their heads at the same moment. Their eyes moved upward. I followed their gaze. Something dark passed across one of the stable skylights from inside. It was only visible for a second. A vague shape, wider than a person, moving beneath the glass. I went back to the door and opened it. The stable lights were off. I used my torch. The beam reached the back wall without showing anything. I checked the roof from below again. Empty. Then the torch dimmed. The battery had been fully charged that morning. The light weakened until it became an orange spot, then returned to normal. From above me came a soft dragging sound. It crossed one roof panel and stopped. I stepped outside and shut the door. Simon had followed me from the house. "What did you see?" he asked. I told him I was not sure. He looked at the roof for a while, then said he would sleep in the downstairs room facing the yard. I drove away around 6. The road from their farm ran between high hedges for almost 2 miles. There were no streetlights. The mist was thick enough that I had to slow down. Halfway to the main road, my radio lost signal. That was common in the area, but instead of static, it made a low, pulsing tone. It came through every station I tried. The tone had a rhythm to it. 3 pulses, a pause, 2 pulses. I turned the radio off. The sound continued for another few seconds through the speakers. Then it stopped. I checked my mirrors. A pale light showed above the hedge behind me. It was not bright enough to light the road. It looked like a gray oval hanging in the mist, maybe 50 meters back. I assumed it was a vehicle coming around a bend, but it did not move like headlights. It stayed at the same height and seemed to follow the road without swaying. I increased my speed. The light remained behind me. At the junction, I turned onto the main road. A delivery van passed in the opposite direction, and for a moment, its headlights filled my mirrors. When the van cleared, the pale oval was gone. I reached home just after 7. My partner, Megan, had left dinner in the oven. I told her the call had been strange, but I did not mention the light because I still thought there was probably a normal explanation. Simon called at 10:36 that night. His voice was quiet. He said the horses had started making noise around 10, not panicking, just moving around the shelter and snorting. He went outside with a torch. A dim shape had risen from behind the barn. At first, he thought it was smoke. He described it as a dark oval with soft edges, large enough to cover part of the sky. It had lifted slowly until it was level with the barn roof. There were no lights on it. The mist around it looked slightly brighter. He said it stayed there for nearly a minute. Then all 6 horses turned their heads together and followed it as it moved above the stable. I asked whether it made any sound. "Not exactly," he said. "I felt it in my teeth." He had called Judith outside, but by the time she came, the shape had moved behind the cloud. The horses had gone quiet immediately. Simon asked if he should call the police. I told him he could, but I could not think what they would do. Nothing had entered the property. No damage had been done. He said he was going to keep the horses out and wait until morning. At 1:14, he called again. This time he said something was inside the stable. He had seen movement through the skylights. Not one shadow, but several dark patches passing under the glass. The stable doors were still locked. I offered to drive back. Megan told me not to, but I felt responsible because the animals were part of the reason he was out there. The mist had turned into light rain by the time I reached the farm. Simon stood in the yard holding a hunting torch. Judith watched from the kitchen window. The horses were pressed together inside the field shelter. I asked Simon whether the movement was still there. He pointed to the stable roof. For about a minute, nothing happened. Then a shadow crossed the first skylight. It moved to the next one. The distance between them was almost 2 meters, but the movement continued without a break, as if something long passed beneath both. The final skylight darkened completely. A faint pressure built in my ears. The stable door rattled once. Simon stepped backward. I unlocked the door and opened it a few inches. Warm air came out. The building had no heating and the power was still shut off, but the air inside felt warmer than the yard by at least 10 degrees. There was also a smell I had not noticed earlier. It was weak and metallic, like coins held in a sweaty hand. I pushed the door wider. My torch beam showed the empty aisle. All the stall doors stood open except the last one. We had left them open that afternoon. The last stall door was latched from the inside. There was no way to reach the latch without entering the stall. Simon and I approached slowly. The horses began moving in the shelter behind us. Their hooves struck the packed earth in an uneven rhythm. I looked through the bars of the stall. The bedding was undisturbed. Nothing stood inside. Above the stall, near the roof beam, the air looked slightly wrong. The torch beam seemed weaker there, as if it passed through mist. The patch was oval and about the size of a small car. It shifted toward us. Not quickly. It moved a few inches at a time. Dust lifted from the top rail without falling. Simon whispered my name. I backed away. The patch moved over the aisle. The pressure in my ears became painful, and the torch pulsed in my hand. 3 dim flashes, a pause, then 2. Something brushed the ceiling directly above us. The roof did not bend, but the metal gave a low groan from one end of the stable to the other. We ran outside. As soon as we cleared the doorway, every horse in the shelter lowered its head. A dark shape rose through the stable roof. I knew that sounded impossible, but I did not see the roof break or open. The shape simply became visible above it, lifting out of the darkness as though it had been hidden by the building. It was large and oval, with no clear surface. I could see cloud through parts of it. Other areas looked solid. It rose about 20 meters and stopped. The rain beneath it seemed to fall more slowly. Simon stood beside me, breathing hard. The shape tilted slightly. A row of faint, dull points appeared along its lower edge. They were not bright enough to cast light. They looked more like pale marks seen through fog. One point moved away from the others. It traveled across the underside and stopped directly above us. The horses began tracking it. All 6 heads moved in the same slow arc. The pressure suddenly released. The shape rose into the cloud without making any sound. For several seconds, the pale points remained visible through the mist. Then they faded one by one. The stable roof clicked as it cooled. We stayed in the yard until nearly 3. Nothing else happened. The electrician arrived after 8 the next morning. He checked every cable, fitting, breaker, and ground connection. He found no fault. The inside latch on the last stall door was still closed. We had to remove the hinge pins to get in. On the top edge of the door, well above head height, there were 5 damp marks. They were narrow and evenly spaced, but they did not look like fingers. Each one was too long and had no print pattern. The marks dried while we watched. The horses returned to the stable 2 days later. They entered the first 5 stalls without trouble. None of them would enter the last one. Simon eventually removed the door and partition and used the space for storage. Several months later, I visited to vaccinate the horses. Everything seemed normal. The weather was clear and the animals were relaxed. While I was examining Tilly, she raised her head and looked toward the stable roof. The other 5 followed. Their eyes moved slowly across the empty air above the yard. Near the last skylight, something tapped 3 times, paused, and tapped twice. I first saw the lights at 6:12 on a Wednesday evening while I was bringing the washing in from the line. I lived in a small rented cottage outside Portlaven on the south coast of Cornwall. The back garden faced the sea, though the view was partly blocked by a low stone wall and a row of wind-bent shrubs. On clear days, I could see fishing boats heading toward the harbor and larger ships farther out. That evening had been cold and damp. A bank of low clouds sat over the water, and there was a fine mist that kept forming on my glasses. The wind had dropped after being strong all afternoon. I noticed the lights because they were in a straight line just above the horizon. There were maybe 12 of them, evenly spaced and pale yellow. From where I stood, they looked like the lit windows of a large passenger ship. I could not see the hull because of the distance and the poor light, but that was not unusual. Sometimes the lower part of a ship disappeared behind the curve of the horizon while the upper decks stayed visible. I finished taking down the clothes and went inside. My partner, Owen, was working late at the harbor workshop. I made tea, fed our cat, and looked out again through the kitchen window. The lights had not moved. That was the first thing that seemed wrong. Ships offshore sometimes appeared stationary, especially if they were waiting for a berth. But these lights were farther west than the usual anchorage. They were also slightly too high. I kept comparing them with the dark line of the sea, trying to work out whether the mist was making the horizon look lower than it was. I took my binoculars from the drawer by the back door. They were ordinary 10x50 binoculars that Owen used for bird watching. I stepped into the garden and rested my elbows on the wall. The lights came into focus. There were 2 rows, not 1. The lower row had 8 lights. The upper row had 5 or 6. They stayed completely steady, with none of movement or flicker I expected from lights seen through damp air. I could not see a hull. I adjusted the focus several times. I could see the black water below, then a narrow strip of lighter sky, then the lights. Nothing connected them. They seemed to hang in empty air. I lowered the binoculars and looked without them. From a distance, it still looked like a ship. I told myself the hull was painted dark and blending into the sea. Then one of the lights moved. It slid slowly upward from the lower row to the upper row and stopped between 2 others. The rest remained fixed. I watched for nearly a minute, waiting for another light to move. None did. A gull flew across my view and passed in front of them. That gave me some sense of distance, though not much. The gull was probably closer than the cliffs at Low Bar, while the lights seemed far beyond that. My phone had no useful zoom, but I tried recording anyway. On the screen, the lights became a fuzzy line. At 6:19, the street lamp beside the cottage went out. The other lamps along the lane stayed on. Ours clicked once, went dark, then came back dimmer than before. At almost the same moment, the cat began scratching at the back door from inside. His name was Pip, and he normally spent half the night outside, even in bad weather. When I opened the door, he did not come out. He stood in the kitchen with his body low and his ears angled backward. I looked toward the sea again. The lights had shifted to the right. I had not seen them move. They were simply farther north than before, still level and evenly spaced. I checked the time. Only a minute had passed. I called Owen. He answered with tools running in the background. I asked whether any large ships were expected offshore. He said he had no idea and asked why. I told him I could see something that looked like a ferry beyond the harbor, but it seemed too high. He laughed and said it was probably a cruise ship distorted by the weather. He mentioned a type of mirage that could make ships look as though they were floating. I had heard of that and felt relieved to have a reasonable answer. I asked him to look when he came outside. He said he would be home around 8. After the call, I went online and searched for ship positions in the area. The map showed a cargo vessel farther south and 2 fishing boats closer to land. Nothing appeared where the lights were. That did not mean much. Some smaller vessels did not show, and the map sometimes updated slowly. I returned to the garden at 6:28. The lights were brighter. A low sound had started outside. At first, I thought it was a boat engine, but it did not have the usual rise and fall. It was a continuous deep vibration that seemed to come from the windows and the stone wall as much as from the sea. I could feel it faintly through the soles of my shoes. The surface of my tea shook in the mug. The mist had thickened over the water. The lights remained clear. I raised the binoculars. The rows now appeared longer. There were more lights at both ends, though I could not be sure whether they had always been there and the mist had hidden them. Between the 2 rows, I saw narrow, dark gaps that reminded me of windows separated by walls. For a second, I thought I could make out a flat, vertical surface behind them. Then, the shape seemed to change depending on how I focused. When I focused on the lights, the dark area disappeared. When I focused beyond them, I saw something broad and black. I walked to the highest part of the garden, near an old shed, hoping to get a better angle. From there, I could see the harbor wall and the lights of houses on the headland. Cars moved along the coast road. Everything looked normal. The object remained beyond the horizon. I called my neighbor, Marianne, who lived 2 cottages down. She was retired and spent more time watching the sea than anyone I knew. I asked whether she could see the ship. "What ship?" she said. "The one with all the lights, straight out from the headland." There was a pause while she went to a window. "I can see a few fishing lights." I described the 2 rows. She said she could not see them. I walked farther along the garden, wondering whether a hedge blocked her view. Then she said, "Wait. Yes, I've got something." Her voice changed. "That's not on the water." I asked what she meant. She said the lights were above the cloud line from her upstairs window. That made no sense because the cloud was low and the lights looked below it from where I stood. We agreed to keep watching. At 6:35, the vibration stopped. It cut off so suddenly that the normal sounds seemed loud. Water dripped from the gutter. A tractor moved somewhere inland. Waves struck the rocks below the cliffs. The lights went out one by one from left to right. I counted 13 in the lower row and 9 in the upper. Each faded over about 2 seconds. When the last one went dark, I could see nothing where the object had been. Marianne called back immediately. "Have you lost it?" I said yes. She told me it was still visible from her window. I moved to the far corner of the garden and climbed onto the low stone wall. The sea was dark and empty. Marianne kept describing it. She said the rows had rotated slightly, with the left side lower than the right. Then she said the lights had become vertical. I told her to take a picture. She tried, but her phone camera showed only darkness. While she was speaking, the lights reappeared for me. They were no longer horizontal. The 2 rows stood at an angle almost 45 degrees, like a ship tipping onto its stern. I could still see no hull. The lower end pointed toward the sea. The upper end disappeared into cloud. I watched through the binoculars as the lights continued to rotate. They moved together without changing their spacing. There was no swinging or sudden shift. The whole arrangement turned slowly until it stood upright. It was then that I understood how large it might have been. If the lights had been the windows of a vessel, the thing would have been far taller than any ship I had seen offshore. The vertical line reached from just above the horizon into the low cloud. The dark area around the lights became clearer. It was not a solid outline. It looked like a section of the sky where the mist behaved differently. Cloud moved around it but did not pass through. Pip scratched at the back door again. I turned for only a second. When I looked back, the vertical lights were closer. I knew that was difficult to judge over open water, but they had grown larger in the binoculars. Individual lights that had looked like points now appeared as narrow rectangles. Several went dark, then returned. Something moved behind them. I saw pale shapes cross two of the rectangles from left to right. They were too indistinct to call people. They might have been reflections or sections of cloud visible through openings. One stopped in the center of a light. The rectangle dimmed around it. I lowered the binoculars because my eyes had begun watering. A white light moved across the sea below the object. It came from a fishing boat heading back toward the harbor. The boat's deck lights bobbed with the waves. The vertical rows did not move at all. The fishing boat passed beneath them. Its engine sound faded. I could still see the boat moving, but for several seconds there was no noise from it, even though the wind carried sound directly toward the cottage. The boat's deck lights flickered. Then the engine sound returned in a burst, much louder than before. The boat changed course toward the harbor. I called the Coast Guard. I hesitated before pressing the button because I did not know how to describe what I was seeing without sounding ridiculous. I said there was an unusual group of lights above the western horizon and asked whether any vessel had reported trouble. The operator was polite. He asked for my location and the approximate bearing. While I gave it, the monitor on my phone made a faint clicking sound, even though the call remained connected. The operator asked me to repeat myself. I did. Then a second voice spoke under his. It was low and too distorted to understand. It sounded as though someone else had joined the line from far away. The operator stopped talking. For 5 seconds, I heard only the faint second voice and the sound of my own breathing. Then the call ended. When I tried again, my phone showed no signal. The lights began rising. They did not accelerate. The whole vertical formation moved upward at a steady walking pace. The bottom light cleared the horizon completely, leaving a visible gap between it and the sea. I could no longer explain it as a ship or a mirage of one. The object passed into the cloud from the top downward. The upper lights faded first. The lower ones remained visible beneath the cloud for several seconds, hanging in a vertical row. The cloud above them brightened faintly, not like lightning. It was a dull gray glow spreading around a dark oval area. Marianne came into my garden through the side gate without knocking. She wore a coat over her night clothes and carried old marine binoculars. She stood beside me and looked up. Neither of us spoke for a while. The last light entered the cloud. The glow moved north above the water. We followed it along the garden wall until the roof of the shed blocked our view. By the time we crossed to the other side, the cloud was dark again. My phone signal returned at 6:51. The call log showed I had spoken to the Coast Guard for 18 seconds. I was certain the call had lasted longer than that. Marianne's kitchen clock said 7:04. My phone and watch both said 6:51. We went into her house and checked the clock on her television. It also said 7:04. The radio time signal matched it. My phone corrected itself a few seconds later, jumping forward 13 minutes. Owen got home shortly after 8. He had seen nothing from the harbor, but one of the fishermen had come in early complaining about a fault with his navigation equipment. I asked whether it was the boat I had watched. Owen said probably. The man's name was Gareth Prowse, and he had reported losing his engine and radio for several minutes. The next morning, I walked down to the harbor and found Gareth near his boat. I told him I had seen him offshore. He said he had been about 3 miles out when every electrical system on the boat failed at once. The engine had kept turning but made no sound, which he admitted did not make sense. He also said the sea had gone flat around him. There had been waves beyond the bow, but the water beside the boat looked smooth and dark. I asked whether he had seen the lights. He looked toward the harbor office before answering. He said he had seen what looked like a line of windows above him, not in the sky ahead, directly above the boat. He refused to say more. Later that afternoon, the Coast Guard returned my call. They had no record of my earlier conversation and no reports of a vessel in distress at the location I gave. The person I spoke to asked whether I might have seen lights from a ship distorted by temperature differences over the sea. I said that was possible. That evening, the weather cleared. Owen and I stood in the garden with the binoculars, but nothing appeared beyond the horizon. For the next week, I checked every night. The sea looked ordinary. On the 8th night, Marianne knocked on our door just after midnight. She handed me a padded envelope without coming inside. She had found an old memory card in her camera and checked the photographs from that Wednesday. Most showed darkness. One image contained a vertical row of pale lights rising into cloud. Below them, the sea and headland were visible. Above the highest light, partly hidden in the cloud, there was a dark shape with a curved edge. Near the center of the image, one narrow rectangle was brighter than the others. Something stood inside it. It had one arm, or something shaped like an arm, raised against the light. When I enlarged the photograph, I could see a small pale mark near the end of it. The mark had the same shape as a hand pressed against glass. I found the circle at 5:37 on a Sunday morning, about 20 meters beyond the northbound crash barrier. I worked motorway maintenance for a contractor covering a section of the M6 between Stafford and Stoke. Most night shifts were routine. We cleared debris, replaced damaged signs, checked drainage, and waited around in laybys until control sent us somewhere. That morning, I was with a new lad named Callum Price. We had been sent to inspect a reported piece of metal near Junction 14. By the time we arrived, whatever had been there was gone, probably dragged away by a lorry or picked up by another crew. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, but the ground was soaked. There was low fog over the fields, and the sky was starting to turn gray. Callum stayed in the cab, filling in the job sheet, while I walked along the verge with a torch. I was checking the fence line in case the metal had been thrown over the barrier. That was when I noticed the grass. There was a flat circular patch about 12 meters across. It sat beyond the drainage ditch in a field owned by a farm on the other side of the boundary fence. At first, I assumed farm machinery had turned there, though there was no gate nearby and no tire track leading to it. The grass was not crushed in random directions. Every blade lay clockwise, like making a clean spiral toward the center. Nothing looked burned. There was no mud thrown up, no broken fence, and no sign that anything heavy had crossed the ditch. The depression looked fresh because rainwater still sat on top of the bent grass in small beads. I called Callum over. He climbed the barrier and complained about his boots sinking into the verge. When he saw the circle, he stopped talking. "What made that?" he asked. "No idea." We stepped through a gap where the lower wire of the fence had come loose. I expected to smell fuel or chemicals. There was only wet soil and the usual sour smell from the ditch. The center of the circle looked darker than the rest. As we got closer, I saw what it was. Moths. Hundreds of them. They lay in a narrow ring about 2 meters wide, all around an empty patch in the middle. Most were small brown or gray moths, but there were larger white ones mixed in. Their wings were open and flat against the grass. None of them moved. Callum crouched near the edge. "Did someone put them here?" I told him not to touch anything. The arrangement was too even to be natural. The bodies formed a ring no wider than my hand. Inside it, the grass stood upright. Outside it, the grass was flattened. It looked as though the moths had fallen along a perfect line. I walked around the circle, trying to find footprints. There were only ours. The mud beside the depression was soft enough to hold every tread from our boots, but there were no tracks entering from another direction. No animal marks either. Callum took several pictures on his phone. While he was doing that, my radio clicked. Control had not called us. There was no voice, only a low burst of static followed by 3 short tones. I answered anyway. "This is Unit 12. Nothing came back. The tones repeated. They were not like the normal network warning beeps. They sounded farther away with a hollow quality, as though another radio had been left transmitting inside a tunnel. Callum's phone screen went black. He pressed the power button and shook it. Battery was on 60%. Mine still worked, so I used it to photograph the ring. The camera would not focus on the center. It focused on the moths and the grass outside, but every picture left the middle as a gray blur. I wiped the lens and tried again. Same result. I stepped into the circle. Callum told me not to. I said I was only checking the ground. The moment my boot crossed the ring of moths, the motorway noise changed. Traffic was still moving behind us, but the sound became dull and distant. I could see a lorry pass above the barrier, yet I heard almost nothing from its engine. The air inside the circle felt warmer. Not hot, just several degrees warmer than the field. The grass in the center was completely dry. I reached down and touched it. Water covered the surrounding grass, but the upright blades inside the ring had no moisture on them at all. My hands started tingling. It felt like the numb sensation after holding a vibrating tool too long. The feeling moved up my fingers toward my wrist. I stepped back over the moths. Normal traffic noise returned at once. Callum had gone pale. He asked whether I had heard the humming. I had not. He said a low humming sound had started when I entered the center. He thought it came from beneath the ground. We went back to the van and called our supervisor, Dean Harcourt. Dean was used to people reporting strange things beside the motorway. Bags of animal remains, abandoned furniture, groups doing rituals under bridges. He usually had an ordinary explanation ready. This time, he was quiet. He asked for the exact marker post number and told us not to disturb the area. Then he asked whether there were dead insects. I looked at Callum. "How did you know that?" Dean did not answer directly. He said he was on his way and told us to wait in the van. It took him 35 minutes to arrive. During that time, the fog thickened. The field slowly disappeared beyond the circle, leaving the flattened grass as the only clear shape. The moths became hard to see from the road, but the center remained visible. It looked darker now, like a hole, although I knew it was level ground. At 6:02, Callum pointed through the windscreen. Something stood at the edge of the field. It was near a line of trees about 100 meters away. The fog hid most of it, but I could see a vertical, dark shape, too narrow to be a cow and too tall to be a fence post. We watched it for maybe 10 seconds. A coach passed in the near lane and blocked our view. When it cleared, the shape was gone. Callum said it had moved before the coach passed. I had not seen that. He said it leaned sideways, almost horizontal, without falling. I told him it had probably been a branch in mist. Neither of us believed that enough to relax. The radio clicked again. This time a voice came through. It sounded like Dean saying, "Stay in the vehicle." I replied that we were inside. The voice repeated the same sentence with exactly the same timing. Then it said it a third time, slower. Dean arrived a few minutes later in a white pickup. He came to our window and asked why I had called him repeatedly. I had only called once. He showed me his phone. There were 5 missed calls from my number between 5:49 and 5:53. My phone showed no outgoing calls. We took him to the circle. By then, several of the moths had disappeared. Not all of them. The ring was still visible, but gaps had opened in it. I thought birds might have taken them, though no birds were in the field. Dean walked around the edge without entering. He had seen something similar 6 years earlier near a closed slip road outside Wolverhampton. He did not give many details. He only said there had been a flattened patch and dead insects, and that the traffic cameras had stopped recording for 11 minutes. I asked what had caused it. He said nobody had found out. He called the control room and asked them to check the nearest traffic cameras. While he waited, I noticed that all 3 of our shadows pointed in different directions. The sun had not risen above the fog, and there was no strong light source near us, but faint shadows stretched from our boots across the grass. Mine went toward the motorway. Callum's went toward the trees. Dean's went directly into the circle. I moved my torch. The shadows did not change. Then a car horn sounded from the motorway, and they vanished. Dean's phone rang. The operator said the camera covering our location had recorded normally until 5:31. The next available frame was at 5:44. There was no error warning and no blank image. The footage simply skipped 13 minutes. A second camera farther north had lost 9 minutes during the same period. The vehicle counters showed continuous traffic flow, so cars had passed, but no images had been saved. Dean told them to preserve the recordings and send him a copy. He then contacted the police through the non-emergency line. They said they would send someone when available because the circle was on private land and there was no immediate danger. We were told to continue our route. Callum did not want to leave. He kept looking back at the field while we drove away. I checked the mirror. The dark shape stood near the tree line again. It was closer to the circle than before. I could not make out a head or arms. It looked like a tall section of fog that did not move with the rest. A lorry passed between us. When I looked again, the shape was inside the circle. I nearly braked. Callum saw it too. For a second, the center looked occupied by something dark and upright. Then the road curved, and the field disappeared behind trees. We completed 2 minor jobs before our shift ended. Neither of us talked much. At the depot, I checked the photographs on my phone. The first 3 showed the flattened circle and the ring of moths clearly. The later pictures had changed. The moths were still visible, but the center was no longer empty. A vertical gray blur stood in the middle of every image taken after 5:50. It was faint enough that I might not have noticed without looking for it. The blur reached from the grass to the top of the frame, its upper part bent slightly toward the camera. Callum's phone had started working again, but all his pictures were missing. He also had a 14-minute gap in his fitness tracker. It recorded his heart rate before we entered the field and again when Dean arrived. Nothing appeared between. Dean told us to send him copies of everything and not to discuss it at work until the police had inspected the site. I went home and slept for a few hours. At 2:20 in the afternoon, Dean called. The police had found the circle, but the moths were gone. The grass had returned upright except for a thin ring at the center. Soil samples showed nothing unusual. The farmer said nobody had been in the field and his gate had remained locked. Dean had also received the camera footage. He sent me the final frame before the gap. The picture showed the motorway under light fog. Our van was parked on the hard shoulder, though according to my job log, we did not arrive until 6 minutes later. I could see myself standing near the barrier. Callum was beside the van. In the field, the grass was still flat. A pale oval shape hung above the circle, no more than a few meters off the ground. It had soft edges and no clear surface. The fog around it formed straight lines like rain blowing sideways. Directly beneath it stood the dark figure. The next frame was 13 minutes later. Our van was in the same position, but Callum and I were both inside it. The circle was visible in the field, and the figure was gone. I asked Dean to check the timestamp again. He had already done that. The camera system used a central clock. It had not been changed. That evening, Callum messaged me a photograph of his bedroom wall. Dozens of small moths were sitting around the window frame. He lived on the 3rd floor of a block of flats in Cannock. His window had been closed all day. I told him to switch off the lights and open it. He said the moths were dead. A week later, we returned to the same stretch of motorway during a daytime shift. I parked in the emergency area and looked across the barrier. The field appeared normal. The grass was long and uneven, and cattle grazed near the trees. The circle had gone. I walked to the boundary fence but did not cross it. Near the drainage ditch, I found one dead moth on the metal barrier. Its wings were open. A thin line of brown dust ran from it along the top of the rail, curving into a narrow ring around one of the bolts. My radio made 3 short tones. After a pause, it made them again. Across the field, every cow lifted its head at the same time and looked toward the empty space above me. I first saw the other aircraft about 40 minutes after leaving Billings. I was flying a King Air C-90 on a medical transport run to Rapid City. We had one patient in the back, a respiratory therapist named Leah Benton, and a flight nurse named Marcos Ruiz. The patient was stable and both crew members were seated behind the cabin divider. It was close to 2 in the morning, cold and clear over eastern Montana, with a thin layer of cloud far below us. My name was Evan Mercer. I had been flying professionally for 12 years and doing medical transport for 4. Most of those trips happened at bad hours in bad weather, so a calm night at 21,000 feet should have been easy. The object appeared off my left side, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. At first, I saw only a white light. It was steady, with no red or green navigation lights that I could make out. That was not immediately strange. Distance and angle could hide one wingtip, and some aircraft lights looked white from the side. I watched it for about 30 seconds. It stayed exactly level with me. I checked the traffic display. Nothing showed nearby. That happens sometimes. Not every aircraft carried equipment that appeared on our system, especially military traffic. I called Minneapolis Center and asked whether they had anything at my 9 o'clock. The controller answered right away. Med Flight 726, negative traffic observed. I looked outside again. The light was still there. It seemed a little larger now, but that could have been because I was paying closer attention. It had no flashing beacon. It looked like a round, dull white lamp suspended in the dark. I asked the controller to confirm. He said the nearest traffic was an airliner more than 30 miles south and several thousand feet above us. I told him I had a visual on something off my left wing. There was a short pause. He asked whether I could identify the type. I said no. The object moved slightly forward until it was near my 10 o'clock position. It did not appear to turn. It simply gained distance along my side while staying at the same altitude. I leaned toward the window and tried to see a body behind the light. There was a dark shape around it, but the night was too black to judge the outline. It looked narrow from front to back, almost like I was seeing the edge of something broad. The autopilot was holding our course. Our instruments looked normal. I made a 5-degree correction to the right. The other aircraft moved with me. It kept the same angle and distance as if both of us had turned around the same central point. That caught my attention. If it had continued straight while I changed heading, it should have drifted toward the rear of my window. Instead, it matched the turn immediately. I returned to our original course. It returned too. There was no delay that I could see. I called the controller again and said the traffic appeared to be maneuvering with me. He told me there was still nothing on radar and asked whether I wanted to change altitude. I said I would descend 500 feet. He approved it. I disconnected the autopilot and eased the aircraft down. The white light descended at the same rate. The vertical speed looked exact. It did not drop before me or follow after. It stayed level with the left side window throughout the maneuver. I stopped at 20,500. The object stopped. A quiet clicking sound began in my headset. It was not on the radio frequency. I still heard the controller clearly when he spoke. The clicks sat underneath his voice, repeating every few seconds. 2 clicks close together, then a longer pause. I switched audio panels and checked the second headset jack. The clicking continued. I asked Marcos to come forward. He slid the divider open and leaned into the cockpit. "What's up?" I pointed through the left window. "Tell me what you see." He looked for several seconds. "That light?" I asked whether it looked like an aircraft. He said it looked too steady. I did not tell him about the matching turns or the radar. I wanted his first impression without influencing him. The object moved slightly closer. Marcos saw that too. The white light grew from a point into a small oval. Behind it, I could just make out several dimmer spots in a horizontal line. They were not bright enough to call windows. They looked like weak reflections on a surface. Marcos asked what traffic control had said. I told him they had nothing. He stared for another moment, then went back to check the patient. He tried to sound casual, but he closed the divider without taking his eyes off the window. I switched to the emergency frequency and made a brief call asking whether any aircraft nearby had visual contact with a King Air over eastern Montana. No one answered. The clicking in my headset became more regular. The object stayed with us for another 10 minutes. During that time, I made 3 small course adjustments, partly because of our route and partly to test it. Each time, the other aircraft copied me. Left turn, right correction, slight climb. It mirrored everything so precisely that I stopped believing it was another plane following us in the normal sense. It was not reacting. It was attached to our movement somehow. I asked the controller whether he was receiving our altitude and position normally. He said yes. Then he asked if we were experiencing equipment issues. I told him no. The truth was that the compass had started moving, not the main heading display. The small magnetic compass above the windshield swayed several degrees left and right, even though the aircraft was steady. It moved slowly, as if the plane were banking in rough air. The air was smooth. I tapped the compass casing with my finger. It continued drifting. The cabin call light came on. Leah asked if I had changed the cabin temperature. She said it had become very cold in the rear. The cockpit temperature felt normal. I turned up the cabin heat and checked the pressurization. Everything showed within limits. A minute later, she called again. She said there was condensation forming inside the left cabin windows. That did not make sense at altitude with the cabin heated. I asked whether it was near the patient. She said no, only along the side facing the light. I told her to close the window shades. She did. The object moved closer again. I could now see a shape around the white oval. It was darker than the sky, but not solid black. The outline kept changing depending on how I looked at it. Sometimes it seemed long and flat. Other times it looked almost vertical, like a narrow fin. There were still no navigation lights, no exhaust glow, no visible wings. I estimated it was 2 or 3 miles away, but without knowing its size, I could not be sure. I asked for a 30-degree right turn. The controller gave me the heading. I rolled gently into it. The object matched the bank. That was the first time I saw its underside. For maybe 2 seconds, the dark shape tilted. A line of 4 dim lights became visible beneath the white one. They were spaced evenly and did not blink. The shape looked much larger than I had assumed. Marcos came forward again without being called. He said the patient's heart monitor had shown interference. The pulse reading remained normal, but the screen had filled with vertical lines for several seconds. He also said Leah's watch had stopped. I checked the cockpit clock. It showed 2:46. My wristwatch showed 2:41. The GPS time showed 2:46. I could not remember exactly when I had last checked my watch, so I assumed it was slow. Marcos looked outside. The object was now slightly ahead of us. He whispered, "Is it turning?" I could not tell. The row of dim lights beneath it had become vertical, one above the other. Either the object was rotating or our angle had changed in a way I could not understand. The clicking in my headset stopped. A low tone replaced it. I felt the tone more than heard it. It vibrated faintly through the control column and the soles of my shoes. The needles on the engine gauges remained steady. The controller called our flight number twice before I answered. His voice sounded distant, though the signal strength was good. He asked whether we had made an unreported turn. I looked at the heading indicator. We were 10 degrees left of the assigned course. I corrected right. The object corrected with me. The controller asked me to confirm that I had returned to heading. I did. Then he said, "Be advised, we lost your primary return for approximately 40 seconds. Our transponder was still on. I cycled it as instructed. The traffic display went blank, then returned. Nothing appeared beside us. The object's white light dimmed. For a moment, I thought it was moving away, but the dark outline stayed in the same place. The light faded until I could see only the row of dull spots beneath it. They looked less like lamps now and more like openings with weak light behind them. One of the spots changed position. It moved slowly along the dark shape from bottom to top, passing the others without disturbing their spacing. Marcos stepped away from the window. "That isn't another aircraft." I told him to go back and keep the patient calm. He asked if we were in danger. I said I did not know. After he left, I considered declaring an emergency. I had no mechanical failure, no collision warning, and no radar traffic. I imagined trying to explain that an unlit object was copying our maneuvers. I worried the controller would assume hypoxia or disorientation. I checked my oxygen saturation with the small finger monitor we carried in the cockpit, 97%. I turned on the overhead light and read every instrument slowly. Airspeed, altitude, heading, engine condition, pressurization. All normal except the magnetic compass, which had now turned nearly 90 degrees away from our actual heading. The object remained outside. I turned off the overhead light. The left windshield showed a faint reflection of my face. Behind it, the white oval brightened again. For an instant, I thought there was another reflection beside mine. A narrow, pale shape appeared in the glass near my shoulder. I turned around. The right seat was empty. When I looked back at the window, the pale reflection was gone. The radio filled with static. Under it, I heard a voice say our flight number. It did not sound like the controller. It sounded lower and slower, with each number separated by a long pause. 7. Static. 2. Static. 6. I answered automatically. There was no response. The real controller came on several seconds later and asked who I was calling. I said I thought I had heard him. He told me he had not transmitted. The object shifted closer. The oval light was now large enough to cover part of the left wingtip from my angle. I still heard no engine or rotor sound. The wing's navigation light reflected faintly against something in the dark. That reflection gave me the clearest view I had of the shape. It seemed smooth and curved, with no seams or markings. It extended farther upward and downward than the light pattern suggested. I could not see where it ended. The left wingtip light went out. The right one stayed on. I checked the switches. Both were selected. I cycled the navigation lights. The left remained dark. The object moved nearer. The tone in the control column became stronger. A thin layer of frost began forming at the corner of the left windshield. I asked for an immediate descent. The controller cleared us down to 18,000 and asked whether I was declaring an emergency. I said not yet. I pushed the nose down. For the first few seconds, the object descended with us. Then it stayed level. We dropped below it. I saw the dim lights rotate above the white oval as our angle changed. The dark mass seemed to extend over us, much farther than I had expected. The cabin lights flickered. Leah called and said the patient was awake and asking why everything had gone quiet. I could still hear the engines. Then I realized I could only hear them through my headset. The actual cockpit had become silent. No airflow, no vibration from the propellers, no rattle from the cabin. The engine instruments still showed normal power, and the aircraft continued descending. I lifted one side of my headset. There was no sound at all. The object stayed above and to our left. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then every sound returned at once. The engines, airflow, radio hiss, and a loose chart vibrating near the center console. The aircraft gave a small shudder. My wristwatch now showed 2:58. The GPS clock showed 3:11. I had lost 13 minutes. I remembered the descent, the silence, and the sounds returning. Nothing between those moments felt missing, but the time was gone. The controller said we had been unresponsive for nearly a minute, not 13. He asked whether I required assistance. I said I had an electrical problem and requested priority handling into Rapid City. That was not exactly true, but it was close enough. The object descended again until it was level with us. It had moved farther back, near our 8 o'clock position. The main white light remained visible, but the smaller lights were gone. I could see Marcos watching it through the cabin door. I thought about what would happen during approach. We would be lower, slower, and busier. I did not want the thing beside us near the airport. I tried the strobe lights. No reaction. I switched the taxi light on and off. Nothing. Then I looked at the landing light switches. The lights were mounted in the wings and aimed forward. At our altitude, they served no purpose, but they were much brighter than the navigation lights. I hesitated because I did not want the sudden reflection to blind me. The object edged closer. I switched on both landing lights. The left side of the aircraft lit up in white glare. For 1 second, I saw the object clearly enough to know it was not shaped like any aircraft I recognized. There was a smooth, dark surface with a deep inward curve. The white oval was not mounted on it. It seemed to sit behind the surface, visible through a narrow opening. Something pale moved across that opening. Then the object disappeared. It did not accelerate away. It did not fade into the distance. The landing lights came on, the shape became visible, and then there was only empty sky. The left navigation light returned at the same moment. The magnetic compass swung back to the correct heading. The frost on the windshield began melting. I left the landing lights on. The controller asked if I still had visual contact with the traffic. I said no. He replied that radar remained clear. We landed at Rapid City without further trouble. Airport emergency crews met us because I had reported an electrical issue. They inspected the aircraft and found nothing wrong. The patient was transferred normally. Leah told me the left cabin windows had cleared as soon as the landing lights came on. Marcos said the interference on the medical monitor had stopped at the same time. Neither of them had seen the object disappear. They had both looked away because of the glare. Maintenance checked the electrical system, lights, compass, radios, pressurization, and engines. Everything tested normally. The flight data showed our planned course with only minor approved deviations. It showed the descent and the brief transponder loss, but no 13-minute gap. My wristwatch remained 13 minutes behind. The next evening, I flew the aircraft back to Billings with another pilot. The weather was clear again. We passed near the same area shortly before midnight. Nothing appeared on the traffic display or outside the windows. As we approached Billings, I switched on the landing lights. The radio clicked twice. A steady white light appeared far behind us, level with the left wing. It stayed there until we entered the airport traffic pattern, then went dark. I saw the reflection during my second round, just after 1 in the morning. I worked security at a natural history museum in Glasgow. The building had been renovated in sections over the years, so half of it was old stone halls and half was newer galleries with glass walls, polished floors, and motion sensors that went off whenever a moth got too close. I was covering the East Wing alone that night. My coworker, Malcolm, was in the control room on the ground floor, and a cleaner named Aileen was finishing in the staff offices. The museum had been closed since 5. No contractors were signed in, and the last school group had left before 4. The gallery was called Early People. It had stone tools, bones, clay figures, and a reconstructed burial display. Most of the objects were inside long glass cases built into the walls. The public lights were off. Only the emergency strips and small lights inside the cases remained on. I was walking past a case of bronze tools when I noticed someone behind me in the glass. The reflection looked like a man standing near the gallery entrance. I stopped and turned. Nobody was there. The entrance opened onto a wide central hall. I could see across it to the staircase and the locked gift shop. There were no pillars or corners close enough for someone to step behind. I shone my torch along the wall. Nothing. When I faced the case again, I saw only my own reflection. I was not especially worried. The glass in that gallery reflected objects from strange angles. A coat on a display stand could look like a person if the room was dark enough. I carried on. About 20 meters farther down, I saw the shape again in another case. This time it was much closer. It stood maybe 2 steps behind me. I could see a head, shoulders, and the upper part of a body. It was darker than my reflection, almost solid black, but the edges were soft. I lifted my right hand. The reflected shape lifted its hand too, but not at the same time. It waited about 2 seconds. Then its arm came up slowly. I lowered mine. Its hand stayed raised. I turned around. The floor behind me was empty. I checked the motion display on my radio. The gallery sensor showed no movement except mine. The doors at both ends remained locked. I called Malcolm. "Can you check camera E4? There was a pause while he switched screens. "I've got you." "Anyone else in here?" No. I looked at the camera mounted above the doorway. Its red light was on. Rewind 30 seconds. Another pause. "Just you, Craig." I did not tell him what I had seen. Malcolm liked practical jokes, and I did not want to spend the rest of the shift listening to him make ghost noises over the radio. I moved to the middle of the room and watched the glass. The dark figure had disappeared. I completed the rest of the round without seeing it again. I checked the fire doors, the emergency exit, and the small education room attached to the gallery. Everything was secure. As I left, I heard a soft scrape behind me. It sounded like a shoe moving across stone. I turned. The gallery was empty. The scrape came again from inside one of the display cases. I walked back and inspected it. The case contained 3 human skulls, a row of tools, and several pieces of pottery. Nothing had fallen or moved. My reflection in the glass looked pale under the emergency lighting. The dark shape stood beside it. It was not behind me this time. In the reflection, it appeared shoulder to shoulder with me, though there was nothing at my side. Its head was turned toward the skulls. I stepped backward. The figure stayed close to the glass. I moved left. It moved right. That was when I stopped thinking it was a bad reflection. I took out my phone and aimed the camera at the case. On the screen, I saw myself and the exhibits. The dark figure did not appear. I lowered the phone. It was still there in the glass. The head turned slowly toward me. I moved away so quickly that my radio struck the edge of a bench. Malcolm called at once. "You all right?" I told him I had bumped into something. He asked if I needed assistance. I said no. I left the gallery and closed the door behind me. In the central hall, the lights were brighter. I could see the entire open floor and both staircases. I stood there for a minute, listening. No footsteps followed me. At 1:18, Malcolm called to say motion had triggered in Early People. I asked where. East side, then center. I looked through the glass door. The gallery appeared empty. The wall cases reflected the emergency lights in long yellow lines. Malcolm said the center sensor had triggered again, then the one near the exit. Something seemed to be moving through the room toward me. I backed away from the door. The handle did not move. A dark reflection passed across the nearest case inside. It looked like someone walking parallel to the glass, but there was no body in the room. The reflection reached the door and stopped. For several seconds, I saw it in the glass panel directly in front of me. It was human-shaped, but the proportions looked slightly wrong. The arms hung too low. The head narrowed toward the top. I could not make out a face. I raised my torch. The reflection raised one arm after a delay. I did not move again. Its hand pressed against the inside of the reflected glass. The real door showed no mark. Then the reflection leaned forward until the head area almost touched the surface. I called Malcolm and told him to meet me in the central hall. He asked why. "I think someone's in the East Gallery. You said the camera was clear." "It still is." That made him stop joking. He said he was coming up. While I waited, the shape disappeared from the door. I watched the cases inside. A second later, it appeared in the reflection of a display farther back. Then another. Then another. It was moving away from me without crossing the space between them. Each appearance lasted only a few seconds. It seemed to step from one reflected surface to the next. Malcolm arrived carrying the master keys and a large torch. He was in his 50s, broad and difficult to scare. He looked through the door and asked what I had seen. I told him there was a reflection moving through the cases. He stared at me. "A reflection of what?" "I don't know." He unlocked the gallery. We went in together. Nothing happened for the first few minutes. We checked every case, bench, cupboard, and doorway. Malcolm tested the motion sensors by walking under them. They worked normally. He said the reflection could have come from vehicle headlights outside. There were no windows in that gallery. We were standing near the bronze tools when Malcolm suddenly looked at the glass. His expression changed. "Is that you?" he asked. I looked. The dark figure stood behind his reflection. It was taller than him by almost a head. Malcolm turned. Nothing was there. He stepped closer to the case. The reflection did not copy him. It stayed in place while his own image grew larger. Then its head tilted sideways. Malcolm swore and moved back. For a moment, both of us stood still. The figure raised one arm. Its hand rested near Malcolm's reflected shoulder, though I could see clear space behind him. He told it to move. I asked who he was speaking to. He did not answer. The reflection lowered its head. A faint tapping began inside the case. 3 light taps against the glass, then 2. The objects inside did not move. Malcolm touched the case with the end of his torch. The figure vanished. The tapping stopped. We left the gallery and locked it. Back in the control room, we reviewed the footage together. The cameras showed us entering, searching, and standing in front of the display case. They did not show the dark figure. At 1:32, the image broke into static for 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, the motion sensors across the entire east wing activated at once, not in sequence. Every sensor went red at the same time. Then they cleared. Malcolm checked the building alarm. No doors had opened, no windows had broken. The roof sensors were normal. Aileen entered the control room while we were reviewing the footage. She asked why we had turned off the lights in the fossil gallery. We had not. That gallery was on the floor above us. Malcolm checked the camera. The main lights were dark, but the display cases remained illuminated. In the glass beside a dinosaur skeleton, a human-shaped reflection stood near the center of the room. The actual floor looked empty. Aileen saw it immediately. "Who's that?" Neither of us answered. The reflection moved across the case. It did not walk smoothly. It shifted a short distance, paused, then shifted again, as if frames were missing between each position. The camera feed froze. When it returned, the shape stood closer. Its head was turned toward the camera. Aileen asked whether someone had broken in. Malcolm locked the control room door. We watched the figure move through 3 different cameras. It appeared only in glass, polished metal, or dark screens. Whenever the view showed open floor, there was nothing there. It crossed the fossil gallery, then the mineral room, then the upper landing. Each location brought it closer to the control room. The upper landing camera showed a large glass wall overlooking the main hall. The reflection appeared at the far end and moved slowly toward the staircase. Malcolm called the police. He reported an intruder visible on camera, but said the person's exact location was unclear. The operator told us to remain where we were. At 1:47, the motion sensor outside the control room activated. The corridor camera showed no one. Aileen stood behind the desk with her phone in both hands. Malcolm held the heavy torch against his chest. I watched the narrow window in the control room door. Our three reflections were visible in the glass. A fourth stood behind us. I looked over my shoulder. The room was empty. In the window, the figure was close to Aileen, its head bent toward her as if looking over her shoulder at the phone. She saw my face and turned around. Nothing was there. The figure in the glass raised one hand. Aileen's phone screen went black. She pressed the power button. It stayed black. The dark reflection moved away from her and came toward me. It did not cross the room. It simply became larger in the glass. I backed against the desk. My reflected body did the same. The figure stopped directly behind it. Its head leaned over my shoulder. I could not see a face, but the area where one should have been looked slightly lighter than the rest, like fog against dark glass. My radio clicked. My own voice came through it. "I think someone's in the East Gallery." It was the sentence I had said to Malcolm earlier. The recording was slow and uneven. The dark figure's head moved as the voice played, as if it were speaking. Malcolm removed the radio from my shoulder and switched it off. The message continued. Then another recording played. A reflection of what? It was Malcolm's voice. The figure in the window turned toward him. He dropped the radio on the desk. The control room lights dimmed. A low vibration began beneath the floor. At first, it felt like distant machinery. The monitors trembled slightly. A cup of pens shifted across the desk. The vibration grew deeper. The building seemed to hum around us. I felt pressure in my teeth and jaw. Aileen covered her ears, though the sound was not loud. On the camera monitors, every reflected surface darkened. The figure appeared in all of them at once. It stood in the early people cases, the fossil gallery glass, the mineral cabinets, the lift doors, and the control room window. Dozens of identical shapes faced in different directions. None matched the empty rooms around them. The vibration became strong enough to rattle the light fittings. The figure behind my reflection stretched upward. Its head reached beyond the top of the window. Its arms lengthened at its sides. The others on the monitors did the same. For a few seconds, they looked less human, like narrow shadows being pulled through the glass. Then the vibration stopped. Every reflection disappeared. The monitors showed empty galleries. The control room window showed only the three of us. The silence afterward was complete. Even the ventilation had stopped. The clock on the wall read 1:50. My phone showed 2:06. Malcolm's watch showed 1:58. None of us had noticed 16 minutes pass. The police arrived at 2:11. Two officers searched the building with us. They found no intruder and no signs of forced entry. The vibration had triggered a fault in one lift and moved several small objects inside the display cases, but nothing was damaged. In early people, the bronze tools had shifted into a rough line along the bottom of the case. At the end of the line was a clear mark on the inside of the glass. It looked like a handprint, but the palm was too long and the 5 finger marks were nearly the same length. The collections manager checked the case the next morning. The locks were intact. Nobody had opened it. The official report blamed the vibration on underground construction several streets away. The construction company denied working during the night. Malcolm refused to discuss the reflections after that. Aileen transferred to the daytime cleaning team. I continued working nights because I needed the job. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then one morning, shortly before the museum opened, I was changing in the staff locker room. A row of narrow mirrors ran above the sinks. I was alone. As I put on my coat, a dark figure appeared in the mirror behind me. I did not turn around. I stood still and watched it. The figure raised its right arm. I kept both hands at my sides. It held the arm up for several seconds. Then it pointed toward the ceiling. A deep vibration passed through the pipes. The mirror shook in its frame. The figure vanished. Above me, from somewhere inside the ventilation shaft, something tapped 3 times, paused, and tapped twice. The signal appeared at 2:13 in the morning while I was trying to clear a fault on receiver 3. I worked nights at a university radio observatory in western New Mexico. The site sat on a dry plateau about an hour from the nearest town, with a cluster of dishes spread across several kilometers of scrubland. I was not an astronomer. My job was mostly systems support, which meant checking logs, restarting equipment, and calling someone more qualified if anything expensive stopped working. That night, I was alone in the control building. There were 2 other people on site, but they were both asleep in the accommodation block. Dr. Lena Varga, the project lead, had gone to bed around midnight. The maintenance supervisor, Calvin Ross, was on call but had been working since sunrise. The weather was clear and cold. Wind moved dust against the windows in soft bursts. The dishes outside were running an automated survey of a quiet area near the border of Pisces and Cetus. Nothing interesting was expected from that part of the sky. That was the point. Lena's group was measuring background noise and testing a new calibration method. Receiver 3 had started reporting a temperature spike, so I opened its diagnostic window. That was when I saw the narrow line. It stood out on the spectrum display as a bright vertical mark against the usual fuzz. It was so thin that at first I thought a single column of pixels had frozen. I refreshed the display. The line remained. Its frequency was just above 420 megahertz, close to a range where we sometimes saw natural hydrogen emissions, though this was much narrower and much stronger than anything in the surrounding data. I assumed interference. That was the normal explanation. Satellites, aircraft, weather equipment, bad cables, local electronics. The observatory was remote, but radio noise traveled. I checked the interference database. Nothing known was scheduled in that band. The signal strength climbed. It was not dramatic at first. The line went from 6 times the background level to 8, then 10. The automatic flagging system marked it red. I switched to the camera feed for dish 7, the antenna using receiver 3. The dish looked normal under the security lights. It was pointed southeast at an angle of about 50 degrees. Nothing moved near the base. I ran a local equipment check. The amplifiers showed normal power. The cooling system was stable. No doors were open. The receiver temperature spike had cleared by itself, but the signal remained. At 2:17, I moved the dish half a degree east. I only meant to test whether the source stayed fixed on the sky. A genuine, distant source should weaken as the dish moved away from it. The motors turned. The signal shifted frequency. It moved downward by a small amount, then climbed back to its original frequency as the dish stopped. The strength stayed nearly the same. I moved the dish half a degree west. The line shifted upward, then returned to center. That was strange enough that I checked whether I'd selected the correct antenna. I had. I moved it a full degree north. Again, the frequency changed during the movement and settled back when the dish stopped. The signal did not become weaker. It was as if I had moved the display beneath the line rather than moving the dish away from the source. I called Lena. She answered on the 5th ring and sounded half asleep. I told her receiver 3 had a strong, narrow signal that was not behaving normally. "Is it drifting?" she asked. "Only when I move the dish." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" I explained the test. She told me not to touch the pointing controls again and said she was coming over. The accommodation block was less than 3 minutes away, but she took nearly 10. While I waited, the signal began pulsing. The line did not switch on and off. Its strength rose and fell in a slow pattern, about once every 11 seconds. I counted 6 pulses. They were not perfectly even. The gap between the 3rd and 4th was slightly longer. I recorded the raw data and copied the current system logs to a separate drive. At 2:23, the control room speakers made a faint click. We did not normally route receiver data through audio because most of it sounded like static, but an audio monitor had been left active after an earlier test. I turned up the volume. A low hiss came through. Under it was a tone so high and thin that I felt it more in my jaw than in my ears. The tone changed whenever the dish tracking motors made small corrections. The dish was following the sky automatically, moving so slowly that the motion was hard to see. Each time it adjusted, the tone bent downward, then returned. I muted the speaker. The tone continued. It came through the small radio on the desk. I switched the radio off. The sound stopped. A few seconds later, the desk phone rang once. When I picked it up, there was no dial tone. I heard the same high sound for maybe 2 seconds, then the line went dead. Lena entered the room wearing boots, a heavy coat, and pajama trousers. She looked at the screen before she spoke. How long? About 10 minutes. She leaned over the keyboard and checked the receiver settings herself. I showed her the movement test in the log. She frowned and asked whether I had changed the Doppler correction. I said no. She opened another panel and disabled automatic frequency correction. The signal immediately slid upward. Then, over several seconds, it moved back toward the center of the display. Lena stared at it. That shouldn't happen, she said. I asked whether it could be a local transmitter. A local transmitter doesn't know where the dish is pointing. She said it quietly, almost to herself. We checked the other antennas. Dish 9, about 2 kilometers away, was looking at a different target using the same receiver band. It showed nothing. Lena redirected it toward the coordinates of Dish 7. The motors took about 40 seconds to move. As Dish 9 approached the target, a weaker version of the line appeared on its spectrum. Dish 7's signal dropped at the same moment. Not much, maybe 10%, but enough for both of us to see. Dish 9 settled on target. The two signals became nearly equal. Lena moved Dish 9 slightly away. Its frequency shifted. Dish 7's signal grew stronger again. She moved it back. The strength divided between them. I asked if that was possible with a normal source. She did not answer. We woke Calvin and told him to check the receiver rooms for any local equipment fault. He was annoyed until he saw the signal on his tablet. Then he stopped complaining. While he drove toward Dish 7, Lena called the campus network office and asked them to confirm there were no tests or transmissions coming from university equipment. The person on duty said nothing was scheduled. At 2:34, the signal strength doubled. Both dishes showed the increase at exactly the same time. A red warning appeared because receiver 3 was approaching saturation. Lena reduced the gain. The line remained at the same height. She reduced it again. The line adjusted upward, almost as if compensating. We both saw it. She pulled her hand away from the controls. Calvin called from his truck. He said his dashboard radio had started losing stations as he drove toward Dish 7. Every frequency carried a faint whistle. His GPS also showed him several hundred meters north of the service road, even though he was driving on it. Lena told him to stop and wait. He asked why. She said we might have a strong local source near the antenna and did not want him entering the area until we knew more. That explanation did not fit what we were seeing, but Calvin accepted it. The pulse pattern changed. Instead of one rise every 11 seconds, the signal produced 3 quick increases, a pause, and 2 slower ones. Then it repeated. I wrote the timing down. Lena told me not to interpret it. I'm not. You're counting it. I count everything. The pattern repeated 4 times. On the 5th, the second slow pulse did not arrive. The signal held steady. The building lights dimmed. Every monitor flickered, but none shut off. The backup system clicked on even though the main power indicator remained green. Outside, the nearest security lamps went dark. The windows turned black. Lena went to the glass and looked toward the dishes. I joined her. The sky was clear enough to see stars, but one section above the southeastern horizon looked empty. It was not cloud. The stars simply seemed weaker there, as though we were looking through tinted glass. I thought my eyes were adjusting badly after the bright screens. Then, the dark area moved. It shifted a small distance to the right, while the stars outside it stayed fixed. Lena asked if I saw it. I said yes. Neither of us described what we meant. The phone rang again. This time, all 4 office phones rang together. 1 ring, then silence. The signal on the display widened. It had been a single narrow line. Now faint sidebands appeared on either side, evenly spaced. They looked like the teeth of a comb. The center remained strong. Lena started recording from every active receiver and saved copies to 2 separate systems. She sent a short message to another observatory asking whether they had anything unusual in the same area. Before the message finished sending, the network connection dropped. Our internal systems remained online, but outside access disappeared. Calvin called again over the handheld radio. His voice broke apart under heavy static. He said there was a light near Dish 7. Lena asked where. Not on the dish, he said. Above it. The transmission cut. We tried calling him back. No response. The control room camera feed from Dish 7 still worked, but the image had become grainy. The dish filled most of the frame. Above its upper edge was a pale patch, no brighter than the sky around it, but smoother, almost featureless. The camera adjusted exposure. The patch remained. It had a curved lower edge. I thought it might be lens flare from a security lamp, but those lamps were off. The dish moved slightly to track the target. The pale shape moved with it. Not across the sky. It stayed in the same position relative to the dish. Lena took manual control and stopped the tracking motors. The signal began drifting down in frequency. She moved the dish west. The frequency rose and returned to center. She moved east. It fell and returned. Then she made a sudden 5-degree change north. The signal disappeared. For 1 second, I felt relieved. A new line appeared at the edge of the display. It swept rapidly across the band and stopped in the center. The strength was higher than before. At the same time, something knocked on the outside wall. It was a dull, metallic sound, like a loose panel shifting in wind. There was no wind strong enough to do that. The knock came again, farther along the wall. Then again, near the window. Lena stepped away from the glass. The security camera above the control building entrance showed an empty concrete path. The image jumped every few seconds, losing 1 or 2 frames. On the 4th jump, a dark vertical shape appeared near the far edge of the picture. It was gone in the next frame. I locked the control room door. The high tone returned through the speakers even though they were muted. It changed pitch slowly, dropping lower until it became audible as a steady hum. The vibration passed through the desk. A cup near the keyboard moved a few millimeters. Lena told me to shut down receiver 3. I entered the command. The system asked for confirmation. I confirmed it. The receiver status changed to offline. The signal remained on the display. I closed the software. The line appeared on a different monitor that was showing only system temperatures. It ran through the middle of the graph, straight and bright. Lena unplugged that monitor. The screen went black. The line remained for almost 2 seconds before fading. Calvin's voice came through the handheld radio. "I'm back at the building." I checked the entrance camera. No one stood outside. Lena asked him to repeat his location. "I'm at the door." The camera still showed an empty path. Then the door handle moved, once down, once up. The radio in Lena's hand said, "Open it." The voice sounded like Calvin, but the timing was wrong. Each word came with a small gap between it. Lena called Calvin's mobile phone. It rang somewhere far away through the radio speaker. Then Calvin answered. He said he was still in his truck near Dish 7. He had not returned to the building. The door handle moved again. We backed into the equipment room and locked the second door. For about a minute, nothing happened. The hum continued. The signal display on Lena's laptop began showing short gaps. They formed the same pattern as before, 3 quick, then 2 slow. A bright white flash filled the small equipment room window. There was no thunder. Every computer restarted at once. The hum stopped. Emergency lights came on. When the main systems returned, the signal was gone. The outside cameras showed normal darkness. The security lamps had switched back on. No one stood near the entrance. Our network connection returned at 2:51. The message to the other observatory had been sent but received no reply. Calvin drove back 5 minutes later. He looked shaken and refused to leave his truck until he saw us standing outside. He said the pale light above Dish 7 had not looked like a light source. It looked like a section of brighter sky shaped like a flattened oval. When he tried to approach, it stayed above the dish no matter where he drove. His radio and GPS failed and he felt pressure in his ears. Then the entire area flashed white. After that, the light was gone. We checked the equipment at sunrise. Nothing was damaged. Receiver 3 passed every diagnostic test. The cables, cooling system, amplifiers, and antenna controls all worked normally. The raw recordings contained the signal. The tracking logs showed the frequency changes, but the timestamps were wrong. According to the data, the event had lasted 38 seconds. The wall clock, phone records, and our written notes showed more than half an hour. Lena sent the files to the university engineering department. Their report came back 2 weeks later. It blamed a software fault combined with local radio interference, possibly from an aircraft or satellite. They said the frequency movement had been caused by an error in the correction system. They did not explain why the signal appeared after the receiver had been shut down. The other observatory replied that they had detected nothing unusual. Lena stopped discussing it. Calvin requested day shifts for the rest of the semester. I kept copies of the original files on an external drive at home. 3 months later, I opened them again. Most of the recordings played normally. One file had changed. It was the last 20 seconds before the flash. The narrow line remained in the center, but the sidebands were gone. Instead, 5 short marks appeared above it, 3 close together, a gap, then 2 farther apart. As I watched, the line shifted slightly toward the right edge of the display. My laptop fan slowed. The marks moved with it and settled back into the center. We got back from the walk at 8:41, and the first thing I noticed was the television lighting up the living room. I could see it through the front window while I was unlocking the door. The curtains were open, and the screen showed a dull green picture that looked like night vision footage. I thought we had left it on. My wife Hannah said she remembered switching it off because our son, Toby, had complained that she turned off his program before the credits finished. Our daughter, Maisie, had already gone around the side of the house to put her scooter in the shed, so I told Hannah it was probably Toby pressing buttons before we left. "I didn't," he said. He was standing between us with both hands in his coat pockets. We lived in a semi-detached house on the edge of York, in a quiet estate built in the late 90s. The front garden was small. There was a short path from the pavement, a patch of grass, and a thick privet hedge separating us from our neighbor, Mr. Ellison. The image on the television showed that garden. At first, I assumed it was a security camera channel from somewhere nearby. The picture looked down from roughly the height of the upstairs windows. I could see the front path, the grass, the hedge, and the bonnet of our car. There was no camera there. I opened the front door, and the image changed a moment later. The door on the screen opened after ours did, delayed by maybe 2 seconds. Then the 4 of us came into view from above. Maisie appeared from the side passage and ran across the grass toward us. On the television, she did the same thing 2 seconds later. She stopped in the hallway when she saw the screen. "Is that us?" Hannah walked into the living room and picked up the remote. The television was an older smart model connected to a streaming box, but we had never linked it to any cameras. We did not own a doorbell camera or an outdoor system. She pressed the home button. Nothing happened. She pressed the power button. The screen went black. Then it came back on by itself. The same picture of the garden returned. Our figures were no longer visible because we were inside, but the front door remained open on the screen. A few seconds later, I closed the real door. The door on the television closed after it. Toby laughed because he thought it was some kind of prank. He ran back outside and waved both arms at the house. His movement appeared on the screen. He stood in the center of the grass, looking up at the upstairs windows, trying to find the camera. I went outside with him. The evening was cold and clear. It had rained earlier, and the paving stones were still damp under the porch light. I checked above the bedroom windows and under the guttering. There was nothing attached to the wall. The angle of the image did not make sense anyway. The camera seemed to be somewhere several meters in front of the house, facing back toward it, maybe level with the upstairs windows. There was no tree, pole, or building in that position. It would have been hanging in the air above the pavement. I stood on the path and looked toward where it should have been. The street was empty. On the television inside, the image showed me looking directly toward it. I felt uncomfortable then, though I still thought there had to be a normal explanation. I went back inside and checked the streaming box. I unplugged its power lead. The picture remained. I unplugged the television. The screen went dark. From the kitchen, Maisie called, "This one's doing it too." A small television sat on top of the refrigerator. We only used it for morning news. It had come on by itself and showed the same view of the garden. The picture quality was worse, but the angle was identical. Hannah stared at it. "That television isn't connected to anything," she said. It had an aerial cable and a power lead. No internet connection. I pulled the plug. The screen switched off. Upstairs, something began playing. It was the television in our bedroom. All 4 of us went up together. The bedroom screen showed the garden. So did the smaller television in the spare room, which had not been used in months. The screens were not perfectly synchronized. Each was delayed by a different amount, but they all showed the same live image. I turned off the bedroom television with the button on the side. It came back on. The screen flickered once and the image became sharper. I could see individual leaves on the hedge moving in the wind. Then I noticed a shape beside it. It stood at the far end of the front garden, near the corner where the hedge met the side fence. At first, it looked like a dark gap between the leaves, but it was too narrow and vertical. I leaned closer to the screen. The shape was roughly human height. It had no detail. It looked like a person standing in deep shadow, though the porch light should have reached that part of the garden. I looked through the bedroom window. Nothing stood beside the hedge. On the television, the silhouette remained. It faced the house. I told Hannah to keep the children upstairs and went down to check the garden. She grabbed my arm and told me not to. I said it was probably a compression error or a shadow from the branches. The silhouette shifted slightly on the screen. It did not step. The upper part seemed to lean toward the front door. Hannah let go of my arm. I took the metal torch from the kitchen drawer and went outside. The garden was empty. I shone the beam over the grass and into the hedge. The leaves were wet, and water dripped onto the soil. There were no footprints except the ones we had made coming home. I stood exactly where the silhouette appeared on the television. Hannah shouted from the bedroom window, "Move away from there." I looked up. She pointed toward the living room window. I could see the television screen through the glass. My own figure stood in the garden on the screen, but the dark silhouette was still there too. It was beside me. I turned so quickly that the torch beam swept across the hedge and the neighbor's fence. There was nobody there. On the screen, the silhouette seemed less than a meter from my left shoulder. I went back inside and locked the door. The children had come downstairs despite what Hannah told them. Toby was standing close to the living room television. "Dad," he said, "it moved when you didn't." The screen showed the front garden with a delay of around 2 seconds. We could see my wet footprints on the path, though they were hard to make out in the green picture. The silhouette had moved to the center of the grass. It stood directly facing the camera. There was still no clear outline of arms or legs. The lower half seemed to fade into the lawn. The head was slightly too small for the height, but I could not tell whether that was because of the poor image. Maisie asked who it was. I told her nobody was outside. She started crying. Hannah closed the curtains, but that did nothing to the picture. The television continued showing the garden from outside. I called the police. I said someone might be standing in our front garden, though I admitted we could only see them through the televisions. The operator asked if I could see the person through a window. I opened the curtain a few centimeters. The garden looked empty. On the television, the silhouette stood near the path. The operator said officers would come when available and told us to stay inside with the doors locked. While I was speaking, a faint sound came from the television. Until then, there had been no audio. Now there was a low rustling noise, like wind moving over a microphone. I could also hear our voices, but badly delayed. My answer to the operator came through the television around 8 seconds after I said it. Then another sound appeared beneath it, a soft clicking. 3 clicks, a pause, then one more. Toby turned toward the screen. "It's tapping." The silhouette raised one side of its upper body. I could not see a hand, but a narrow part extended toward the house. The clicking came again. This time it came from the front window. Hannah pulled the children away from the living room. I ended the call and switched on every outside light. The porch light came on. The side light came on. The motion light over the garage stayed dark. The television image brightened slightly, but the silhouette did not. It remained a flat, dark shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. I went to the electrical panel and shut off the main power. Every light in the house went out. The television stayed on. Their screens gave off a pale green glow in the rooms and upstairs hallway. I could see the same garden image through several doorways. The silhouette stood in a different position on each screen. On the living room television, it was by the path. On the kitchen television, it stood beside the hedge. On the bedroom television upstairs, Hannah said it was directly below the camera. The pictures were no longer showing the same moment. The children began panicking. I turned the power back on, but nothing changed. The front door handle moved. It went down slowly and returned. All 4 televisions showed the door staying closed. A second later, the handle moved on the screens. The silhouette did not move. Someone knocked once. Not loudly. It was a careful tap in the middle of the door. Hannah took the children into the kitchen. I stood in the hallway with the torch even though the lights were on. Another knock came from the side window, then one from the living room glass, then the upstairs bedroom window. Each sound was separated by 2 or 3 seconds, moving around the house too quickly for a person. The televisions picked up none of it. Instead, the audio carried a low, steady hum. The picture began shaking slightly. The silhouette on the living room screen leaned forward. The head area changed shape. For a moment, 2 faint lighter marks appeared where a face should have been. They were narrow and set far apart. I could not tell whether they were reflections or gaps in the image. Maisie shouted from the kitchen. The small television above the refrigerator had changed. It no longer showed the garden. It showed our hallway. The angle looked down from the top of the stairs. We were all visible. I stood near the front door. Hannah held both children by the kitchen entrance. There was no camera at the top of the stairs. Behind me, at the far edge of the television picture, the silhouette stood against the wall. I turned around. The hallway was empty. On the screen, the shape moved closer. It did not walk. It became taller, then narrower, as if it were moving toward the camera without crossing the floor. I grabbed the kitchen television and pulled it from the wall socket. It went black. The living room television changed to the hallway view. So did the screens upstairs. The image showed us from above with the dark shape behind me. The delay was gone. When I lifted my arm, my image lifted its arm at the same moment. I moved left. The silhouette moved left too, keeping the same distance behind me. I felt a pressure at the back of my neck, like someone holding a hand close to the skin without touching. Hannah could see it on the screen. She told me not to move. The hum grew louder. The ceiling light above the stairs dimmed, though the other lights stayed bright. A cold patch moved down the hallway. I felt it pass over my legs and stop near the front door. The silhouette on the screen turned away from me. It faced the door. Outside, the porch light went out. Every screen changed back to the garden. The silhouette was there again, standing on the path. A second shape now stood beside it. This one was shorter and harder to see. It appeared only when the picture flickered, like a shadow hidden between frames. The 2 shapes faced the street. I heard a car approaching. Headlights moved across the curtains as a vehicle turned into our road. On the screen, the shapes stretched sideways. The police car passed in front of the garden and blocked the camera's view. For less than a second, the television showed only the side of the vehicle. When it cleared, both silhouettes were gone. The picture remained for a moment longer. Then every television switched back to the channel or menu it had been showing before we left for the walk. The sound stopped. The house felt normal again. 2 officers checked the garden, side passage, shed, and the road behind the houses. They found nobody. There were no marks on the grass except ours, and no damage to the doors or windows. I showed them the televisions, but they worked normally. The officer tried each remote and checked the cables. He said it might have been a crossed wireless signal, though he agreed that did not explain the older sets. Our neighbor, Mr. Ellison, came outside while they were there. He had heard the knocking. He said it began at his back window, moved along the side of his house, and stopped near the hedge between our gardens. His television had not turned on. The next morning, I checked the outside walls again in daylight. There was no camera. Near the hedge, I found a damp oval patch on the grass where the silhouette had first appeared. It was about the size of a person standing with their feet together. The surrounding lawn had dried in the morning sun, but that patch remained wet and cold. Toby stood in the doorway while I examined it. He told me the image on the television had not been from above the pavement. I asked what he meant. He said he had looked carefully when he went outside and waved. The camera moved when I moved, he said. I told him cameras sometimes tracked people. He shook his head. No, it wasn't watching the garden. He pointed at the upstairs windows. It was looking out from inside the house. I noticed the reflection in the Roman gallery at 1:26 in the morning. I had worked night security at the Ashwell Museum in Leeds for almost 3 years. The building had 4 public floors, 2 closed storage levels, and a newer glass extension attached to the original stone structure. Most nights were quiet. I walked the same route every hour, checked the fire doors, signed the room sheets, and watched the cameras from the control office between rounds. That night, I was covering alone because my coworker Des had called in sick. One of the cleaners, Farah, had left just after midnight, and the maintenance contractor had gone before 11. As far as I knew, I was the only person in the building. The Roman gallery was on the 2nd floor. It had long glass cases running down both walls, with coins, pottery, tools, and small statues inside. The main lights were off overnight, but low security lighting stayed on near the floor. It made the glass reflective, so I usually saw myself as I passed. I was halfway along the first case when I saw someone behind me. The reflection was dark and roughly human-shaped. It stood about 4 meters back, close to the doorway I had just entered through. I turned around. The gallery was empty. The doorway opened onto a wide landing with nowhere to hide except behind a stone pillar, and I could see both sides of it from where I stood. I aimed my torch at the landing. Nothing moved. When I looked back at the display case, the reflection had gone. I assumed it had been my own shadow distorted by the uneven glass. The cases were old, and some panels bent reflections badly. A fire extinguisher or coat stand in another room could sometimes look like a person from the wrong angle. I continued my round. Near the end of the case, I stopped to sign the inspection sheet clipped beside the emergency exit. As I wrote the time, I saw the reflection again in the glass. This time, it stood closer. It was directly behind my left shoulder. I could see my own reflection clearly. Navy jumper, radio clipped to my chest, torch in one hand, clipboard in the other. Beside me was a second shape with a narrow head and shoulders that sloped too sharply. I did not move at first. The reflection did. Its head turned toward me. I spun around. Nothing stood there. The gallery remained silent. The floor was polished stone, so I should have heard anyone approaching. I checked behind every case, under the benches, and inside the small education room next door. The room contained folding chairs and a locked cupboard. The only other door was alarmed and showed as secure on my radio panel. I called the control office. There was no one there to answer, of course, but the internal line connected to the recording system. I said my name, location, and that I was investigating possible movement in Gallery 2. Saying it out loud made the situation feel more ordinary. I returned to the landing and checked the nearest camera on my phone. The museum system allowed us to view live feeds through a secure app. Camera 2B covered the gallery entrance. The image showed the empty landing and the doorway. I moved my arm to make sure it was live. A second later, I saw myself appear at the edge of the frame. No one stood behind me. I replayed the previous 5 minutes. The footage showed me entering the gallery alone. At 1:26, I stopped and turned. At 1:29, I searched the landing. Nothing else appeared. I went downstairs to the control office. The office had 6 monitors showing 16 camera feeds. All doors and motion sensors displayed green. I checked the entry logs. My keycard was the last one used at 10:42 p.m. No external door had opened since then. The building made noises at night. Pipes clicked, lifts settled, and the old roof expanded when the temperature changed. I was used to all of that. What bothered me was how definite the reflection had looked. It had not been a quick shape at the edge of my vision. I had watched it turn its head. I made coffee and stayed in the office until 2. At 2:03, motion sensor 2R activated in the Roman gallery. The camera showed nothing. The sensor cleared, then activated again farther along the room. The system displayed the movement as a sequence: entrance, center, east end. It looked like someone walking through the gallery. I called the police control number we used for non-emergency building checks. I did not request officers yet. I reported a possible sensor fault and said I was going to inspect it. I took the heavier torch and the master keys. Before leaving the office, I switched on the full lights in the Roman gallery remotely. The camera feed brightened. For less than a second, a dark figure appeared beside the long display case. The picture broke into square blocks, then cleared. The room was empty again. I replayed the moment. The recording jumped from 2:04:11 to 2:04:14. 3 seconds were missing. I called the police again and asked for a patrol to attend. I said there might be an intruder, though I had no confirmed visual. They told me to stay in the control office. I should have done that. Instead, I watched the cameras for another minute and saw the figure in a different gallery. It appeared only as a reflection. Gallery 3 held medieval metalwork in tall glass cabinets. The camera faced one of those cabinets at an angle. On the screen, the room itself was empty, but a human-shaped reflection stood in the glass. It was facing the camera. I enlarged the feed. The shape had no visible face. Its head looked smooth and slightly longer than normal. One arm hung lower than the other. The figure leaned to one side. The movement was slow and careful, like it was trying to see around the edge of the case. Then the camera froze. When it restarted, the reflection was gone. The motion sensor outside the control office activated. I looked at the corridor feed. Nothing was there. The office door had a narrow, wired glass window. I could see the corridor through it. The lights were on and the floor was empty. A soft, dragging sound passed outside the door. It moved from left to right. I held my radio close and listened. The dragging stopped. A reflection appeared in the office window. I saw myself standing inside, but behind my reflection was the dark shape. It was close enough that its head rose above mine. I turned. The office was empty. When I looked back, the shape remained in the glass. It lifted one arm. I had not moved. Its hand or the end of its arm came up beside my reflected head. There were no clear fingers. The glass made everything slightly blurred, but the limb looked too thin. I stepped sideways. My reflection moved. The other shape stayed where it was. Then it turned and walked out of the reflected view. There was no corresponding movement in the room. I locked the office door and switched on the radio. Control to attending unit. Possible intruder now near ground floor security office. The dispatcher asked whether I could see the person. I said not directly. There was a pause before she replied. She told me officers were 6 minutes away. I watched the corridor camera. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Then a shadow crossed the far wall. The corridor lights did not change, and nothing passed in front of them. The shadow moved against the direction of the light and disappeared beneath the camera. The handle of the office door pressed down. The lock held. It returned slowly. I backed away from the door. The handle moved again. This time, the reflection in the window did not match it. In the glass, the door appeared closed and still. Behind my reflection, the shape stood inside the office. I could not make myself turn around. I watched it in the window. It was about a meter behind me, near the filing cabinet. The head tilted forward. The shoulders looked narrow, and the body faded below the waist into the darker reflection of the floor. I raised my torch. The figure raised its arm a second later. It did not copy me exactly. It seemed to watch the movement, then perform a slower version of it. I pointed the torch over my shoulder and switched it on. The beam lit the empty filing cabinet. In the window, the shape remained. The torchlight passed through its reflection without changing it. I turned fully. There was nothing behind me. The filing cabinet, chair, kettle, and coat hooks were all where they should have been. When I faced the window again, the reflection was gone. A sound came through my radio. It was my own voice saying, "Possible intruder now near ground floor security office." The recording played back slowly, with gaps between the words. I pressed the transmit button. The radio went silent. Then another voice came through. It was too low to understand. It spoke for about 5 seconds, stopped, and repeated the same sounds. I removed the radio battery. The voice continued. I put the radio on the desk and moved away from it. The control monitors flickered. Every camera feed switched to a view of the Roman gallery. That should not have been possible. Each screen normally showed a different live camera, but all 6 displayed the same glass case from slightly different levels of brightness. The gallery lights were off again. A reflection stood at the far end of the case, then another appeared beside it, then a third. The room itself looked empty. The shapes existed only in the glass. They were spaced several meters apart facing the camera. The center figure moved first. It came closer without walking. Its reflection simply grew larger from one frame to the next. The 2 others followed. I tried changing cameras, but the controls did not respond. The center shape reached the point where my reflection had first appeared earlier that night. It stopped. Its head turned toward something outside the camera view. The office lights dimmed. A deep vibration passed through the floor. It began gently, like a heavy lorry driving beneath the building. The coffee in my cup formed small circles. The monitor screens trembled against their mounts. The vibration grew stronger. I heard glass cases rattling in distant galleries. The fire doors shook in their frames. Dust fell from the ceiling vent. It did not feel like construction or traffic. The museum stood away from the main road, and the vibration came from all directions at once. My ears filled with pressure. The three reflected figures on the monitors changed shape. Their outlines stretched upward. The heads narrowed, and the bodies became thin vertical marks in the glass. Then they disappeared. Every camera returned to its normal view. The vibration stopped. All sounds stopped with it. For several seconds, I heard no ventilation, electrical hum, or traffic outside. The building felt sealed. The office clock showed 2:08. That was impossible. The motion alert in the Roman gallery had started after 2, and I had spent much longer than 8 minutes checking cameras and calling the police. My phone showed 2:23. The computer clock changed from 2:08 to 2:23 while I watched. The desk radio clicked once. The green power light went out, even though the battery had already been removed. Someone knocked on the external security door. I checked the camera before opening it. 2 uniformed police officers stood outside. I let them in and explained that I had seen someone moving through the galleries. I left out the part about the reflections at first. I said the camera system had malfunctioned, and I believed an intruder might still be inside. The officers were named Patel and Brennan. They searched the museum with me while a second unit checked the exterior. Every room was empty. No cases had been opened. No alarms had triggered. All external doors remained locked. In the Roman gallery, several objects inside the long display case had moved. A line of small bronze coins normally lay flat on dark fabric. 4 were standing on their edges. Officer Patel asked whether they were displayed that way. I said no. He touched the outside of the glass. A thin line of condensation formed beneath his fingers on the inside of the case. The gallery was dry and temperature controlled. At the far end, we found a hand-shaped mark on the inner glass. It was too high for a visitor to reach without climbing into the case, and the case had not been opened. The mark had no fingerprint lines. It looked more like 5 narrow smears connected to a long palm. The officers checked the roof access and service tunnels. They found nothing. Before leaving, Brennan asked whether I was sure I had not fallen asleep in the control office. I told him I had video. When we returned to the monitors, the recordings showed no figures. The missing 3 seconds at 2:04 had been restored. The footage showed an empty gallery throughout. The camera outside the office showed the door handle moving twice on its own. That was the only part both officers agreed was unusual. The next morning, my manager, Elaine, reviewed the system logs. She blamed the vibration on a freight train passing through a tunnel several streets away, though trains had never shaken the museum like that before. She said the reflections were probably caused by delayed video frames and low lighting. I asked about the standing coins. She told me the collection staff must have moved them. The collection staff denied it. I finished my shift at 7 and drove home in daylight. I stopped at a petrol station for coffee and checked my rearview mirror several times on the way. Nothing followed me. I slept until mid-afternoon. That evening, Elaine called and asked whether I had entered the museum's Egyptian storage room during the night. I said no. She sent me a still image from the internal camera. The picture was timestamped 2:14 a.m. while I was locked inside the control office. It showed the storage room door open. A figure wearing my security uniform stood between 2 metal shelving units with its back to the camera. Its head was turned toward a glass-fronted cabinet. In the cabinet's reflection, the figure faced the camera. It had my face, but its mouth was open and its eyes were looking toward something behind it. On the shelf beside the reflected figure, a dark shape stood with one narrow arm resting on its shoulder. I turned off Route 46 a little after 10 because the plows hadn't been through the county roads yet, and I didn't feel like crawling behind a line of cars all the way back to Millbrook. That was the whole reason I ended up on Old Quarry Road. It wasn't a shortcut I used much in winter. It ran behind a couple of dairy farms, past the old limestone pit, then through 6 miles of empty woods before it came out near my subdivision. In summer, it was fine. In January, it was narrow and dark and usually had deer standing in the middle of it like they owned the place. I had been at my cousin Lena's house in Poughkeepsie, watching her kids while she worked late. The snow had started around 6 and got heavier around 8. By the time she came home, my car had a thick white cap on it, and the streets were covered. I brushed it off with my sleeve because I'd forgotten my scraper again when I then sat in the car for 5 minutes with the heat blasting in my hands, tucked under my armpits. My name is Marisa Vale. I was 34 then. I drove a gray Honda CR-V with one fog light out and a back wiper that made a sad little squeak every time it crossed the glass. I wasn't someone who went looking for weird things. I worked billing at a physical therapy office. I lived alone with a cat named Milo. My biggest problem that week had been whether my landlord was actually going to fix the washing machine in the basement. The snow made everything slow. The headlights caught fat flakes, and the road looked like it was coming toward me instead of me driving over it. I kept both hands on the wheel and stayed around 25. My phone was in the cup holder, playing a podcast through the speakers, but the signal kept dropping and the voices would cut out mid-sentence. Once I left the main road, it got much quieter. No houses close to the street, no porch lights. Just black trees on both sides and the white lane in front of me. The snow had stopped falling by then, or almost stopped, but the wind pushed loose powder across the road in little sheets. The first odd thing happened about a mile in. I passed the mailbox cluster near the Henderson farm, and my headlights caught tracks in the snow ahead of me. Not tire tracks, something narrower. 2 lines running down the center of the lane, side by side, like someone had dragged a ladder along the road. I slowed down. The lines stayed perfectly straight. They didn't wobble like tire ruts, and they didn't have footprints beside them. They just ran between the yellow lines, cutting through the fresh snow. I followed them for maybe 30 seconds before they curved off to the right and disappeared into the ditch. There was no break in the snowbank where they went in. No mess. No sign that anything heavy had slid off the road. I remember saying, "What the hell?" out loud, not scared yet, just confused. The podcast came back for half a second. A man laughed, then the audio popped and went silent. I tapped the screen. No service. That was normal out there, so I kept driving. The road dipped after the quarry entrance. There was a metal gate on the left with a rusty "no trespassing" sign, and beyond it the old pit was just a dark hole behind a line of pines. In daylight, you could see the drop-off and the frozen water at the bottom. At night, especially in snow, it looked like the trees ended and the world stopped. My headlights flickered right as I passed the gate. Not off, exactly. They dimmed, like the battery had sagged, then came back. The dashboard lights did it too. The heater fan slowed for a second and then returned to full blast. I looked at the battery light, but nothing came on. The car felt normal. No sputtering, no warning chimes. Then my outside temperature display changed from 18 degrees to 41. I stared at it long enough that the car drifted toward the shoulder and I corrected hard. The tires slipped a little and caught again. The display stayed at 41 for maybe 5 seconds, then dropped to 17. I knew cars could glitch. Sensors got snow-packed around them. I told myself that and tried to relax my grip on the wheel. The road curved left, then straightened into the long stretch that ran along the backside of the quarry woods. That part had always felt longer than it was. No driveways, no power lines, no streetlights, just road and trees. About halfway down that straightaway, the snow disappeared. It didn't thin out. It didn't become slush. It just ended. I drove over a clean line where the white road turned to bare black pavement. The tires changed sound right away, from that soft crunching roll to a dry hum. I actually tapped the brake because my brain didn't understand what I was seeing. The pavement ahead was completely dry. Not plowed, not salted, dry. There were no wet patches, no dirty slush pushed to the sides, no tire marks. The yellow lines looked fresh and bright. The shoulders were dry too, about 2 feet out, and then after that, the snow started again in the grass and weeds like a white wall. I stopped the car. I shouldn't have, but I did. The road was empty behind me and empty ahead. I put it in park and kept my foot on the brake, like that somehow made it safer. The headlights lit up a perfect strip of road that looked like it belonged to a different night. The car clock said 10:26. The heater was still blowing hot, but the windshield had started to fog at the edges. I wiped a circle with my sleeve and leaned forward. The dry stretch went on as far as the headlights reached. Maybe farther. The trees on both sides were still loaded with snow. The branches sagged under it. The field beyond the right shoulder was untouched, except for a few weed stems poking through. It was only the road that had been cleared, and not cleared in any way I had ever seen. I opened my door. Cold air hit my face, but it had a strange warm layer under it, like standing near a dryer vent outside. I stepped down carefully. My boot landed on dry asphalt. No crunch, no ice, just a little grit under the sole. I looked behind the car. The line where the snow ended was sharp. My rear tires were maybe 2 feet past it. Behind me, the road was snow-covered all the way back around the bend. My tire tracks came up to the line, then stopped being visible because there was nothing to mark. I knelt and touched the pavement with 2 fingers. It was warm, not hot. Warm like a sidewalk after sun, except there hadn't been sun for hours and it was below freezing. I pressed my palm flat. The road had heat in it. That was when I started feeling nervous. I got back in the car and shut the door. The inside light faded slowly. For a second, the reflection in the side window looked wrong, like there was someone standing behind the car in the road. I snapped my head around, but there was nothing there except my own tracks in the snow behind me and the darkness beyond the taillights. I put the car in drive and kept going. The dry road continued. No snow fell onto it from the branches. No water ran across it. It looked like a tunnel had been cut through the weather, only without walls. My headlights seemed to reach farther than usual, and the darkness around the trees looked flat, almost like a painted backdrop. After about a minute, I noticed there were no animal tracks crossing the road. On winter nights out there were always prints somewhere. Deer, raccoons, stray dogs, whatever. Even after fresh snow, you'd see little crossings near the shoulders. Along that dry part, there was nothing. The snow on either side was smooth, untouched. Then I heard the humming. At first, I thought it was the tires on dry pavement because the sound had changed when the snow ended. But this was lower, steady, and it didn't rise or fall with my speed. I took my foot off the gas. The car slowed from 20 to 10. The hum stayed the same. I turned the fan down. The sound got clearer. It came from outside, or maybe from under the car. A low electrical note, not loud but full, like when you stand near a big transformer box. I could feel it in the steering wheel. My fingers tingled a little. The temperature display jumped again, 18 to 38, then 52. Then it went blank. The podcast app opened by itself on my phone. I didn't touch it. The screen lit up in the cup holder, showing the paused episode. Then it skipped forward, then back, then the progress bar began sliding slowly on its own from left to right. No audio came through the speakers. The title disappeared. The screen went black. I said nope and started driving faster. The CRV did not want to go faster. The engine revved, but the car felt heavy, like I was towing something. I pushed the pedal down and got to maybe 30. The road ahead stayed dry and straight. I should have reached the old stone bridge by then, but I hadn't. I knew that road. There was the quarry gate, then the long stretch, then a small bridge over a creek, then the first house with the blue mailbox. I had been on that stretch too long. I checked the clock again. 10:26. The minute hadn't changed. I looked away, then back. Still 10:26. My mouth went dry. I grabbed my phone and pressed the side button. It said 10:26 too, and the battery was at 3%. It had been at 47 when I left Lena's. The humming deepened. Something moved in the trees to my left. I didn't see a person. I didn't see an animal. I saw a dark gap move between the trunks, matching my speed for a few seconds. It was taller than a deer and too narrow for a car. The headlights didn't reach it directly, but it blocked the pale snow behind the trees as it moved. I stared too long and drifted toward the center line. When I looked back at the road, there was a shape standing ahead. I hit the brakes. The anti-lock kicked under my foot with a rough chatter, even though the road was dry. The car stopped maybe 20 feet from it. It was not a person. That was the first clear thought I had, and then I immediately argued with myself because what else could stand in the middle of a road? It was about the height of a road sign, maybe a little taller, thin, dark. It looked like a bundle of wet branches tied upright, but smoother, with no arms or legs I could make sense of. It stood just inside the reach of the headlights, not fully lit, almost like the light bent around it. The edges of it seemed soft, not blurry exactly, but hard to focus on. I locked the doors. The sound of the locks was too loud in the car. The thing didn't move. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see anything reflective like eyes. It was just there in the lane, facing me or not facing me. I had no way to tell. My first stupid instinct was to honk. My hand moved toward the horn, then stopped. Something about making a loud noise felt like a bad idea. I put the car in reverse. The backup camera came on, but the screen showed static, not black. Gray static, like an old TV. I twisted around and looked through the rear window instead. The road behind me was dry and empty for maybe 30 feet. After that, the snow line was gone, not behind me anymore. The dry pavement stretched back into darkness. I reversed anyway. The car rolled back slowly. The shape in front of me stayed where it was. I went 10 feet, 15, maybe 20. Then the rear tires bumped something. Not hard, just a dull thud like backing into a curb. There was no curb on that road. I stopped and looked behind me again. Nothing. The backup camera still hissed with static. I tried the wiper, and it squeaked across the rear glass once, smearing road salt and melted snow. When I turned forward again, the shape was closer. It hadn't walked. I hadn't seen it move. It was just closer, maybe 10 feet from the hood now. The headlights washed over the pavement around it, but the body itself stayed dull and dark. I could see one detail then, and I wish I hadn't noticed it. The snow on both shoulders had melted in circles. Not all the snow, just circles, maybe the size of trash can lids, appearing one by one along the edge of the road, as if something invisible and warm was being placed down in a line. A circle would darken, collapse into wet grass, then another would appear a few feet ahead. They were moving toward my car from both sides. I started crying then, but quietly. It wasn't dramatic. My eyes just filled and my breathing got thin. I kept saying please over and over, not to anyone specific. The car engine stuttered. The dashboard went black. The headlights stayed on. That made no sense, but they did. The engine died, the radio died, the speedometer dropped, and the headlights kept shining on the thing in the road. The humming became the only sound. I reached for the key, even though it was a push start. My fingers couldn't find anything useful. I pressed the start button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The dashboard flashed once, showing every warning light at the same time, then went dark. Something tapped the passenger window. 3 soft taps. I turned my head slowly. There was nothing there. The window showed the snowy shoulder and the trees beyond it. Then the glass fogged from the outside in 3 round spots, each one spreading into a perfect circle. They formed a triangle, high on the window, too high for someone crouching, too low for a branch. I didn't move. The taps came again, this time on the rear passenger window. 3 of them. Then the rear glass. Then the driver's side back window. It was going around the car. Not fast, not in a hurry. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. The dark shape in front of the car had not moved, but now it felt like there were more of them outside the headlights. I couldn't see them directly. I could only see narrow places where the snow and trees didn't look right, where the darkness had a thickness to it. I shut my eyes. That didn't help. The humming got stronger with my eyes closed, like the sound was inside my skull. I opened them again because not seeing felt worse. The shape in front of me leaned. I say leaned because I don't know another word for it. The top part angled slightly toward the car. The headlights flickered and stretched its shadow backward, long and thin across the road. For 1 second, I saw the shadow divide into 3 separate lines, then join again. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up. It showed an incoming call from Lena. I grabbed it so fast I dropped it into the footwell. I fumbled around, hit answer, and shouted her name. No voice came through. There was only the same low hum, but sharper through the phone speaker. Under it, very faint, I heard what sounded like my turn signal clicking. I looked at the dashboard. The turn signal wasn't on. The phone screen still showed Lena's name, but the call timer was wrong. It read 17 teens 17 and didn't change. Then a voice came through. It was my voice. Not a recording I recognized. Not words, exactly. More like someone playing back the sound of me breathing and whispering in the car, but a half second behind. I heard myself say please through the phone after I had already said it. I heard my own breathing double. I dropped the phone again. The tapping stopped all at once. The shape in front of me was gone. The road ahead was empty and dry, stretching into darkness. The humming faded until all I could hear was my own breath and the faint tick of cooling metal from the engine. I didn't wait to understand it. I pressed the start button again. The car started. Everything came back too bright. Dashboard, heater, radio, the little green light on the heated seat button. The headlights dipped and corrected. My phone was in the footwell. Screen cracked across one corner. Battery at 31%. The clock said 11:14. I put the car in drive and went. For the first few seconds, I expected the shape to appear again, or the car to die, or the road to stretch out forever. But the CRV drove normally. The engine had power. The tires hummed on dry pavement. Then, without warning, I crossed back into snow. It happened the same way it started. A sharp line across the road, dry black pavement turning to packed white snow. The tires crunched. The car fishtailed a little, and I slowed down, almost sobbing, because the normal slippery road felt like proof that I was back where I belonged. 10 seconds later, I reached the stone bridge. I pulled over just before it and parked half on the shoulder. I sat there with the engine running and the doors locked. Snow fell from the trees in soft clumps. The creek under the bridge moved black between white banks. My phone had service again. I called Lena. She answered on the second ring, sleepy and annoyed. I asked if she had just called me. She said no. I told her to check. She said she hadn't touched her phone since I left, and then she asked why I sounded like that. I told her I hit a weird patch of road and got scared. That was all I could get out. She stayed on the phone with me while I drove the rest of the way home. The first house with the blue mailbox was exactly where it should have been. Then came the bend by the little cemetery, then the stop sign by the volunteer fire station, then the newer streets of my subdivision with porch lights and snowmen and trash bins at the curb. Everything looked normal in a way that felt almost rude. I parked in my spot at 11:39. Milo was waiting inside the apartment door, yelling for food like always. The heat was on. The kitchen clock said 11:40. Snow tapped lightly against the windows. I stood in the entryway for a while with my boots on, holding my keys, because I didn't know what to do next. Eventually, I took off my coat and put water on for tea. My hands shook so much that I spilled it on the counter. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights on and watched the snow stop around 2 in the morning. In the morning, I checked the car. There were 3 round, clean spots on the passenger window, arranged in a triangle. Not fingerprints, not smears. Clean spots, like someone had warmed the glass there and melted the road film away. There were the same marks on the rear window and the driver's side back window. The tires looked fine. The battery tested fine later that week. My mechanic, Arturo, said the car had no stored codes except one low-voltage event that didn't tell him much. He asked if it had been hard to start in the cold. I said yes, because that was easier. I drove back to Old Quarry Road 2 days later in daylight. I brought Lena with me because I didn't want to go alone, and because part of me needed someone else to see the road. The weather was clear then, bright and cold. Snow still covered the fields and woods. The county had plowed by that point, leaving dirty ridges along both sides. The stretch behind the quarry looked normal. There was snow packed along the shoulders, tire tracks, salt, a few frozen puddles. The pavement was wet in places, icy in others. No perfect dry strip, no melted circles in the grass, no sign that anything had happened. But near the middle of the straightaway, Lena noticed the fence. On the quarry side, about 20 feet back from the road, the old chain-link fence had a section that bowed inward, not broken, bowed like it had softened and sagged. The snow beneath it was smooth and untouched. No footprints, no tire marks, just that bent fence and a round patch of dead grass showing through the snow behind it, about 6 feet across. Lena looked at it, then looked at me. Neither of us said much after that. That night, I checked my phone records because I wanted to see the call from Lena. There was no incoming call at 11:14. There was no call around that time at all. The only one listed was the call I made to her from near the bridge at 11:19, the one she answered. The cracked screen still worked, but sometimes when the battery dropped below 30%, the phone opened the podcast app by itself and jumped to the same timestamp in the episode. It was always 17 minutes and 17 seconds in. I listened to that part once. It was just the host talking about old houses in Vermont. Nothing strange, no hidden sound, no weird phrase. A week later, after a little rain warmed things up, I washed the car at the gas station on Route 9. The clean circles on the windows disappeared under the soap and brushes. I felt better watching them go. When I got home, there was a patch of dry pavement in my parking space. Only my space. The rest of the lot was wet from melted snow and car wash runoff, dripping off my tires. My space was completely dry under the car and about 2 feet around it, with a sharp edge where the wet asphalt began. I stood there holding the floor mats I had taken out to vacuum, staring at the ground until my neighbor Priya came down to take her dog out and asked if I was okay. I said I had dropped something. She helped me look, even though there was nothing to find. I noticed the moving object while I was sitting on a folding chair behind my uncle's cabin near Ely, Minnesota. I had gone up there alone for 3 days because I needed a break from work and my apartment building was having plumbing repairs. The cabin sat near the edge of Burnside Lake, far enough from town that the sky was properly dark. My uncle Patrick used the place mostly in summer, but it was early October and already cold at night. The weather was clear and dry. There was no moon and the temperature had dropped close to freezing. I wore a wool hat and had a blanket over my legs. I had brought a cheap pair of binoculars and a paper star chart because I had recently started trying to learn the constellations. I was looking toward the northeast, trying to find Cassiopeia, when I saw what I thought was a satellite. It was a small white point moving steadily between the stars. It didn't blink, and it wasn't bright enough to be a plane. Satellites were common up there, so I followed it through the binoculars without thinking much about it. Then it changed direction, not sharply. It curved slightly to the left, passed between two stars, then bent back to the right. I lowered the binoculars. With my eyes alone, I could not find it. I raised them again and picked it up near the same group of stars. The object moved in a slow, weaving pattern. It passed close to one star, curved around another, and continued upward. The movement looked smooth, almost casual. That was strange because the stars it appeared to weave between were not near each other in any real sense. I knew that. One could be a few dozen light years away, and another hundreds. Whatever I was watching had to be much closer, and the weaving was only a matter of perspective. Still, it looked deliberate. The point never changed brightness. It did not speed up or slow down. It didn't blink, flare, or leave a trail. I watched for about a minute. Then it stopped. It remained fixed between two stars. My arms began to ache from holding the binoculars, so I rested my elbows on my knees. The point stayed still. I counted to 30. Nothing changed. I thought maybe I had lost it and was staring at an ordinary star. I lowered the binoculars, memorized its position, and looked up without them. There was no star there. When I raised the binoculars again, the point remained. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. I checked the lenses for dust or a reflection. I turned toward the cabin lights, then back to the sky. The point disappeared when I moved away and returned when I aimed at the same place. I switched the binoculars between my eyes. It was visible through both sides. The object started moving again. This time it went down. It traced a loose S shape through the star field, then stopped beside a bright star I later identified as Capella. It stayed there for several seconds, moved behind the star, and appeared on the other side. I understood that it could not literally pass behind a star, but that was exactly how it looked. The white point approached Capella, vanished when it touched the brighter light, then came out from the opposite side. I put the binoculars down. The woods around the cabin were quiet. There had been small sounds all evening. Leaves moving, branches creaking, something splashing near the shoreline. Now I heard nothing except my own breathing. I looked toward the lake. The water was black and flat. The lights of one distant house showed across the bay, but there were no boats. I picked up my phone and opened a star tracking app. I held it toward the northeast. The screen showed the constellations and a few labeled planets. There was no aircraft warning or satellite track, though I knew those apps were not always accurate. The phone's compass began spinning. The sky map rotated slowly, even though I held the phone still. I lowered it. The compass settled. I raised it again. The map turned until north pointed behind me. I closed the app. The binoculars were still on my lap. I considered going inside, but I wanted to see whether the object was still there. I told myself that if I watched it carefully, I would understand what it was. A drone, a satellite with an odd path, maybe a small insect reflecting light close to the lenses. I looked again. The white point was lower. It had moved from the northeast to a position directly over the lake. I knew that should not have meant anything. I had no way to judge its distance or altitude. But it felt lower, not just lower in the sky. The point moved between stars in short, smooth curves. It would drift left, stop, move right, then continue downward. It seemed to be choosing gaps. I followed until it reached the dark outline of the treetops across the bay. Instead of disappearing behind the trees, it stopped just above them. Then a second point appeared beside it. The second light was identical. Same size, same steady white color. The 2 points moved apart slowly. A third appeared between them. They formed a straight horizontal line. I lowered the binoculars. With my own eyes, I saw a faint white speck above the opposite shore, only one. I raised the binoculars again. 3 points. They held their positions for several seconds, then began moving independently. One drifted upward. Another moved left. The third stayed still. The effect made me feel disoriented. I kept trying to judge whether I was watching 3 separate things or one thing changing shape. The stationary point dimmed slightly. It was the first change in brightness I had seen. Then it brightened back to normal. The 2 moving points curved toward it. All 3 came together and became one. At that exact moment, something clicked behind me. It came from near the cabin wall. 3 dry clicks, evenly spaced. I turned around. The porch light was off. I had left the kitchen light on inside, and a yellow rectangle showed through the window. No one stood near the cabin. I shone my flashlight around the steps and woodpile. Nothing moved. The clicking came again, farther away this time, from the trees beside the driveway. I told myself it was an animal, a squirrel, a bird, maybe branches touching. I went inside and locked the door. The cabin was small. 1 main room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. The heater hummed near the kitchen table. Everything looked normal. I left the curtains open and watched the lake through the window. The white point was visible without binoculars now. It hung above the tree line across the water. I checked the time. It was 10:42. I had gone outside just before 10. I thought I had been watching for maybe 15 minutes. My phone showed no missed calls or messages. The battery was at 38%, down from almost full. I plugged it in. The charging symbol appeared, but the percentage dropped to 37. The heater shut off. The cabin went silent. A faint tone came from outside. It was very low, almost below hearing. It seemed to press against the windows rather than pass through them. The glass made a light, vibrating sound in the frames. The white point moved. It crossed above the lake from left to right, weaving in the same slow pattern I had seen among the stars. As it passed over the dark water, a pale reflection followed beneath it. The reflection did not match. The light above moved right. The reflection moved left. I stepped closer to the window. The reflected point traveled across the lake toward the cabin. There were no ripples around it. It looked like a small white light beneath the surface, moving steadily through black water. The actual light in the sky stopped over the far shore. The reflection continued. I watched it reach the middle of the bay. Then it vanished. Something bumped the dock. The sound was soft but clear. I had pulled my uncle's canoe onto shore earlier that afternoon. Nothing should have been tied there. Another bump came. Then the wooden boards creaked as if weight had settled onto them. I turned off the kitchen light. The window became a dark mirror for a second, then my eyes adjusted. The white point remained above the far trees. The dock was barely visible, a darker line against the water. A pale shape stood at the end. It was not bright. I saw only a narrow vertical outline, lighter than the lake behind it. I moved to the side of the window so I would not be directly visible. The shape did not move. I picked up my phone and tried to call Patrick. The call connected, but there was no ringing tone. After several seconds, I heard my own voice. It said, "I'm at the cabin." I had not spoken yet. Then Patrick's voice came through. "Who's there with you?" I ended the call. My hands had started shaking. I looked at the phone screen. The call history showed no outgoing call. The pale shape remained on the dock. The white point above the lake began descending. It moved slowly toward the tree line, still weaving from side to side. Each curve was small and controlled. The shape on the dock tilted its head upward. That was the first clear movement I saw. Its body was too thin for the way the coat or clothing hung. I could not see arms. The head looked narrow and slightly longer than normal. I backed away from the window. The floor beneath me gave a faint vibration. A spoon in the sink rattled once. The cabin lights came on by themselves. The overhead fixture, bedroom lamp, bathroom light, and porch light all lit at the same time. The shape on the dock disappeared. The white point above the trees stayed visible. Then every light went out. The heater, refrigerator, and phone chargers stopped. I stood in the dark, holding the phone. The screen showed 10:47. Only 5 minutes had passed since I last checked. A knock came from the roof. Not loud, one knock above the kitchen, then another over the bedroom, then a third near the front door. I moved into the hallway and locked the bathroom door behind me. It was the only room without an exterior window. I sat on the closed toilet lid and listened. The roof made small creaking sounds. Something crossed from one end of the cabin to the other. The movement was too slow for an animal running. It sounded like weight being placed carefully on each section of roof. My phone lit up. The camera app opened without me touching it. The screen showed the outside of the cabin from across the lake. I saw the whole building, the porch, the dark windows, and the line of trees behind it. The angle was low, almost level with the water. A white point hovered above the roof. 3 pale shapes stood around the cabin, one near the porch, one beside the bedroom window, one behind the woodpile. I covered the phone camera with my thumb. The image did not change. The shape near the porch lifted its head. The bathroom door handle moved. Very slightly. It pressed down, returned, then pressed down again. I held the lock with one hand even though it was already secure. A voice spoke from the other side. It sounded like Patrick. "Eli, open the door." I didn't answer. The voice repeated my name. The second time, it sounded like my mother. She had been dead for 6 years. I put both hands over my ears. The voice continued, but the words became unclear. The tone stayed familiar while the sounds underneath it changed. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no roof creaks, no voice. The phone camera returned to normal and showed my own knees. The power came back. The bathroom light turned on. The fan started. The heater clicked in the next room. I waited several minutes before unlocking the door. The cabin was empty. The front door remained locked. The windows were closed. Nothing had been moved. Outside, the white point was gone. I checked the time. My phone showed 12:09. The wall clock showed 10:51. I had lost more than an hour. I did not stay there. I packed my clothes, carried everything to the car, and kept the porch light on while I loaded. The dock was empty. I did not see footprints near it, but the ground was hard and covered with pine needles. The car started normally. I drove toward Ely with the doors locked. The road was narrow and dark with trees close on both sides. For the first few miles, nothing happened. Then I saw the white point in the rearview mirror. It hung above the road behind me. It did not blink or change brightness. As I drove, it moved left and right between the stars, following the same slow weaving path. I increased my speed. The point stayed the same size. I turned onto the main highway. It followed. A pickup passed going the opposite direction. For a moment, its headlights filled the car, and the white point disappeared in the glare. When the road went dark again, it was directly above me. I could not see it through the windshield, only through the glass roof panel over the front seats. It moved across the stars without sound. The radio switched on. A low voice came through the speakers. It sounded like mine. It said, "I'm at the cabin." I pulled into a 24-hour petrol station on the edge of town. There were 2 trucks at the pumps and a woman working behind the counter. As soon as I stopped beneath the bright canopy lights, the radio went silent. The white point was gone. I stayed inside the shop until sunrise. I called Patrick after 6. He answered normally. He said he had not called me during the night and had not asked who was with me. I drove to his house in Duluth instead of returning to the cabin. When I arrived, he came outside and looked at the roof of my car. There were 3 clean oval patches in the frost. Each one was about the size of a hand. They ran in a straight line from the back window toward the front. Patrick touched one. The metal was warm. I made it home that afternoon. Binoculars were still on the passenger seat. I had